Hey everyone, welcome to Nightmare Scene. Before we begin, I'd love to know, which city are you listening from as you hear these spine-chilling stories? Leave a comment to let me know. Alright, now take a deep breath. Let's begin. I had been hiking for hours trying to enjoy the calm of nature. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense trees. I was lost, not having paid attention to the trail markers, and the light was quickly fading. It was getting late and I needed to find shelter. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old cabin tucked away in the woods. It looked abandoned, but I had no other choice. I decided to spend the night there. The cabin smelled musty and the wooden floor creaked with every step I took. There were old, faded curtains on the windows, and the furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was almost suffocating. I figured I'd just rest for the night and head back in the morning, so I locked the door behind me and settled in. But then something strange happened. At first it was subtle, a slight noise like something scraping against the wall outside. I brushed it off as an animal or the wind, but then I heard it again. A faint whispering so quiet I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but I convinced myself that I was just on edge. I tried to distract myself by reading a book I found on the dusty table, but the whispering persisted. It sounded like two voices, though I couldn't make out any words. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of someone knocking on the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? The nearest town was miles away, and I hadn't seen a soul since I entered the forest. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and then it stopped. Silence. My mind raced. Was it a prank? I told myself it was just my imagination, but the fear that crept into my chest was real. I didn't want to open the door, but something in me urged me to check. I slowly approached the door and peered through the small crack in the wooden frame. I saw nothing, just the dark outline of trees under the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. I was about to turn away when I heard it again, a whisper, clearer this time. "Let me in." I froze. It was coming from just outside the door. My pulse quickened as I backed away, heart pounding in my ears. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was being watched, like something, or someone, was circling me. The lights flickered, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. I looked out the window, but all I could see was darkness. The whispering grew louder, now a soft chant of incomprehensible words. I had to leave, but the door was locked from the inside and I couldn't find the key. Suddenly, I heard something scraping at the window. I looked up to see a pale face pressed against the glass. The eyes were wide, hollow, and unblinking. My blood ran cold. I screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no way out. The face on the glass disappeared as quickly as it appeared, and the door suddenly swung open. I didn't think twice. I ran. I darted through the forest, not caring where I was going, just desperate to escape whatever was lurking behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where a passing car finally stopped to help me. The driver looked at me with confusion when I tried to explain. I was trembling, breathless, and barely able to speak. The next day, I returned to the cabin with the intention of getting my gear. But when I reached the spot where I had spent the night, there was nothing. No cabin. Just an empty patch of forest, as if it had never existed. I walked around looking for any sign of it, but there was nothing. Only the faint echo of a whisper carried on the wind. I never told anyone what happened, but I've never gone hiking again. The memory of that face still haunts me, and sometimes late at night I hear whispers. That night, I thought everything would be as usual. The weather outside had started to turn overcast, with dark clouds slowly obscuring the sky. You know, the city is always full of noise and busyness, and occasionally I like to escape that pressure and retreat to this cabin deep in the forest for a little solitude. I bought this place 3 years ago, about 10 kilometers away from the nearest village, surrounded by dense woods. There are no neighbors, and the only social interaction I have is when I go to the nearby town to buy some supplies. Tonight, everything seemed just as quiet as usual. However, things began to feel off. That evening, the rain started pouring down. The sound of it hammering on the roof was deafening, punctuated by the occasional rumble of thunder. The kitchen lights were dim, and I was absent-mindedly cooking dinner while watching TV to kill time. The program was so boring that I was about to fall asleep when I heard a soft knock at the door. I hesitated. Who would come by at this time? The cabin is isolated. There are no other houses around. No one should be visiting. The knock came again, this time louder, almost as if someone was impatiently urging me to open the door. I put down my spatula and walked toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. My heart began to race, but I tried to convince myself it was just a prank or a misunderstanding. But then, just as I turned back to the kitchen, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't gentle. It was a rapid, urgent banging, as if someone was desperately trying to get in. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I approached the door again and looked through the peephole. This time I saw a hand, pale and thin, its fingertips almost translucent, slipping through the crack under the door. It hung there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. My heart felt like it had stopped. I took a few steps back, my body trembling, my breath shallow. The hand remained there, unmoving. No threat, no sound. Just silence. I backed away slowly, trying to stay calm. It was just a hand, I told myself. There was no reason to panic. But my skin was cold and my legs felt weak. Then, slowly, the hand withdrew. No noise. It was as if it had never been there at all. My mind was in a haze, but I made myself check every room, lock all the windows, and double-check the door. Everything seemed fine. Yet something was still off. The silence outside felt heavier now, more suffocating. Was I imagining things? I began to question whether I had seen anything at all. Later that night, another knock at the door. This time, the knocking didn't stop. I crept to the door and pressed my ear to it, my heart hammering in my chest. The knocks grew more frantic, like someone was pounding desperately, demanding to be let in. I took a deep breath and carefully turned the door handle, my pulse racing. I peered through the peephole one last time. In the rain, a figure stood there, a man. His clothes were soaked, his hair hanging in messy strands over his face. He was tall, but his movements were slow and dragging. He stopped right in front of the door, lowering his head as though waiting for something. I didn't dare look for long. I quickly turned and bolted back to the bedroom, grabbing my phone, only to find there was no signal. My breath came in short gasps as the footsteps outside grew louder. They were closer now, like they were right outside my window, right by the door, creeping toward me. He didn't speak. He just stood there, and the silence, so deep, so unnatural, began to weigh on me. Every second felt like an eternity, and I could feel him watching, waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself not to hear, not to feel the horror creeping in. Suddenly there was a loud crash. I jolted awake, gasping for air. My window had shattered. The sound of glass breaking was so sharp, so violent, it felt like it was ripping my soul in half. I sprinted for the door, desperate to escape, but the lock jammed. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with the bolt. Then I felt it, an ice-cold hand grabbing my ankle. I screamed, kicking out, and scrambled to my feet, managing to yank open the door and sprint into the rain-drenched forest. The cold mud sucked at my feet as I ran, the sound of my breath and heartbeat pounding in my ears. In the distance I saw a light. A car's headlights, I thought. I ran toward it, toward safety, not daring to look back. But as I neared, something grabbed my ankle again, yanking me down into the muck. I turned to see him. The man. His face was twisted into a grotesque smile, his mouth slightly open, as if whispering something I couldn't hear. I froze, unable to move, feeling like I was being swallowed by the darkness. Then, just as I thought I would be pulled under for good, I saw the headlights coming closer. I struggled, crawled, and somehow reached the light. I was rescued by the police. They took me back to the town, questioning me about what had happened, but I couldn't explain. They said they found no trace of anyone out there, except for a set of muddy footprints, which vanished into the rain. Back at my house, I couldn't shake the feeling. That terror, that face, that smile. It lingers in my mind even now. The officers couldn't find a single clue as to who or what that man was. All they said was, "It doesn't make sense." But sometimes in the quiet of the night, I still hear knocking at my door. I didn't mean to be here. It started innocently enough, just a weekend getaway to clear my head. The cabin was secluded, tucked away in the woods miles from the nearest neighbor. My phone had no signal, and the rain kept coming down in sheets, drumming against the roof. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, but something was off. The first night I heard it, the scraping. At first I convinced myself it was just the wind, the trees brushing against the walls, but by the second night I wasn't so sure. The sound was too deliberate, too constant. Something, or someone, was scraping at the door. I didn't sleep at all that night, lying wide-eyed in the dark, heart hammering, listening. When the sun rose, I thought maybe I was just losing my mind. I forced myself to go outside, but the forest was eerily silent, and the air felt wrong. There was a heavy, damp smell that seemed to cling to everything, even the old wood of the cabin. I tried to ignore it, going about my day, chopping wood, making coffee. Then, around dusk, I saw him. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks, too much time alone. But no, there was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just out of reach of the cabin's porch light. Tall, impossibly thin, with a pale face that looked like it had been bleached by the moonlight. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light, and he didn't move. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. My heart started pounding, the pit of my stomach dropping as I locked the door behind me. The scraping started again, louder this time, coming from the outside just beneath the window. I pressed my hands to my ears to block it out, but it didn't help. It never stopped. I needed to leave. I grabbed my coat, pulled on my boots, and ran out the back door toward the truck. But the figure was already there, blocking the path. "Leave?" His voice rasped as if his throat hadn't been used in years. I froze. "Please," I begged, backing away, but he didn't move. Something in the way he stood, tall and motionless, made it clear that I couldn't run. Not without consequences. His lips twisted into a grotesque smile, but it was so wide, so unnatural that it barely resembled a human expression. He reached into his coat and pulled out something small, silver, reflecting the faint moonlight. A knife. I didn't wait to see what he would do with it. I ran, full throttle, into the trees, heart thumping in my chest, breath ragged. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him following, the soft crunch of footsteps on wet leaves growing louder. Closer. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found the road. The headlights of an approaching car lit up the darkness, and I flagged it down without hesitation. The driver didn't say a word as I jumped into the passenger seat, but as we sped away, I could have sworn I saw the figure in the rearview mirror, still standing there, motionless. The car took me to a nearby town, and I called for help. When the authorities finally arrived at the cabin, it was empty. The doors were locked, the windows intact. No signs of the strange man, just the incessant scratching sound echoing from the woods. I left the next morning, but the feeling stayed with me. I never went back to that cabin. But I still hear the scraping sometimes late at night when I'm alone. That night it was pouring rain, and the wind howled like some unseen force tearing through the air. I was alone at home, the house surrounded by nothing but forest, with the nearest neighbor 5 kilometers away. Being isolated in such a place always made me feel lonely, and with the weather so terrible, it felt even worse. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, thinking about how I'd have to go into town tomorrow for some groceries. Then suddenly there was a faint thud against the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I walked over to the window, squinting through the glass to see what it was, but there was nothing. The rain was so heavy, it drowned out everything else, and for a moment the world seemed eerily still. I forced myself to return to the kitchen, but the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Then came the doorbell. The sound made my heart leap into my throat. Who on earth would come out here at this hour, with the weather this bad? Who is it? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Then the doorbell rang again. More urgently this time, as if the person outside was in a hurry. My heartbeat quickened, a sense of dread creeping in. I cautiously walked to the door and looked through the peephole. I saw nothing but darkness and rain. I wasn't sure if I had misheard or if it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but without thinking, I unlocked the door and opened it. A stench of decay hit me, sharp and nauseating. I inhaled sharply, almost choking. Standing outside was a middle-aged man, dressed in a tattered coat. His face was pale, his eyes locked onto mine with a chilling intensity, and his lips curled into a grin that looked more like a grimace. "Need some help?" His voice was low, almost a rasp, like it had come from deep in his throat. I froze. I didn't know how to respond. My instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. I was about to slam the door shut, but before I could, he reached out with one hand and pressed it gently against the doorframe. "You should let me in," he murmured, his words like ice that pierced through me. My hands shook as I tried to push the door back, but it felt like he was holding it in place. The panic surged, and I quickly slammed the door shut with all my strength, locking it in a frenzy. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I rushed to the phone to call the police, but there was no signal. The rain poured harder, and I could hear him moving around outside, his footsteps dragging slowly on the wet ground. I peered through the window, and there he was, still standing in the yard, staring directly at my window with those lifeless eyes, his smile never fading. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away from the window, moving quickly to the living room and locking all the doors. Then I heard it, soft at first, a faint creak as if someone was walking on the wooden floor. I darted to the window and peeked through the curtain. I saw him standing in the yard, turning slowly, scanning every corner of the house with those hollow, penetrating eyes. Suddenly, the trees outside rustled violently as though someone was moving through the forest. My heart jumped in my chest, and I nearly froze in place. I grabbed my phone again, desperate to call for help, but the screen went black. It had died. My stomach twisted as I realized I was completely cut off. Then came the doorbell again, this time accompanied by a series of heavy knocks. The sound grew frantic, more desperate. His voice came through the door, "I won't leave until you let me in." I held my breath, paralyzed. Then I realized something. He wasn't at the door anymore. That split second felt like an eternity. I hesitated, then slowly crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to look outside. There, in the dark, I saw a shadow, moving quickly, disappearing into the night. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then I noticed something. On the wall near the corner of the room, a piece of paper was taped up. I pulled it off and unfolded it. The note read, "Next time we meet, you won't be so lucky." I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my bag, I ran to the garage, barely able to catch my breath. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. When I got in the car and started it, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing by the window, was the same man watching me leave, his grin still frozen on his face as if he had never moved. It had been a long day of driving, and the fatigue was settling into my bones as I navigated the empty stretch of highway. The only light came from my headlights, slicing through the darkness, and the steady hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound. I was on my way to a small cabin I had rented for the weekend, hoping to get some peace and quiet in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place where your phone barely gets any signal, and the nearest neighbor is miles away. As I turned a corner, I saw something in the distance, a figure standing by the side of the road. It struck me as odd. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, especially at this time of night? I slowed down, my eyes narrowing as I approached. The figure was tall, dressed in a long coat and holding something in their hands. My instincts told me to drive past quickly, but curiosity got the better of me. I rolled down the window a little. "Need a ride?" I called out, my voice barely audible over the engine's growl. The person didn't respond. They just stood there staring at the car. The faint light from my headlights illuminated their face for a moment. They were older, their features weathered, but what struck me most was their eyes. They were completely black, no whites, just deep, endless darkness. I froze. Something about the sight of those eyes made my blood run cold. Without thinking, I hit the gas, speeding away from the figure as quickly as I could. My hands were clammy on the wheel and my heart was racing, but I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just a hitchhiker or some crazy person out here looking for attention. The next few miles felt longer than they should have. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me. Nothing. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter. Finally, I saw the turnoff for the cabin. A narrow gravel road led into the woods, where the cabin was tucked away. I turned onto it, the gravel crunching under the tires, and within moments, I was surrounded by trees and darkness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I parked the car and got out, the cold air hitting me like a wall. The cabin was small but cozy looking, with a faint light shining through the windows. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No sounds of wind, no rustling of trees, just the eerie stillness. I shrugged it off and set my things down in the living room. I was exhausted, and the thought of a hot shower and a warm bed was enough to distract me. I made my way to the bathroom, but as I passed the window, I caught something in my peripheral vision. I stopped. A figure, standing just outside between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped closer to the window, my hand trembling on the curtain. I pulled it back just a little, barely enough to see. There, in the darkness, stood the same person I had seen on the road. My stomach twisted into knots. There was no way they could have gotten here so quickly, especially with how far I had driven. I felt my pulse race as I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was another person, someone else out here in the woods. But as I turned away from the window, I heard something else. A soft tapping on the glass, like a finger gently drumming. I froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were locked in place. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was like someone was pounding on the glass, desperate to get in. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I rushed to the door and locked it, my hands shaking as I twisted the bolt into place. I ran to the back door, locking that too. Every window, every door, nothing was left unsealed. But it didn't stop. The tapping continued, now all around the cabin, as if whoever, or whatever, it was circling me. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I couldn't even call for help. My mind raced as I searched the cabin, looking for something to defend myself with, but all I could find was a small kitchen knife. I went to the door, peeking through the peephole, hoping to see something that would explain this. What I saw froze me in place. The figure was standing directly in front of the door now, only inches away from the glass. They were smiling. That same twisted grin from before, their black eyes staring right into mine as if they could see through the door. I felt a surge of panic and turned away from the door, backing into the darkened hallway. The tapping had stopped, but there was something worse now, silence. Complete and utter silence. Then I heard a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't wait for whatever this was to get inside. I ran to the back door, flung it open, and bolted into the woods, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the wet earth beneath me. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road. By then, the rain had started to pour again, and I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably. But when I looked back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The figure was standing in the doorway watching me. Their black eyes glinted in the dark, and they slowly raised their hand, waving at me. I got into my car, started it without thinking, and sped off, not daring to look back. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. And I couldn't help but wonder, how did they get there so fast? I had never felt so relieved to reach my apartment after a long work trip. The constant noise and chaos of the city had been wearing me down, and I was eager to relax for the weekend. It was late, and the streets outside were quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. As I unlocked my door, I noticed the usual faint smell of pizza from the takeout place downstairs. It felt comforting. The building was old, but the solitude had always given me a sense of peace. I stepped inside, dropped my bags, and locked the door behind me. The only light in the apartment was from the kitchen, where I had left a lamp on. I kicked off my shoes and headed toward the couch, but something caught my eye, a small note lying on the coffee table. My brow furrowed as I picked it up. "I'm already here. I'll be waiting." The handwriting was erratic, almost frantic, and it sent a chill through me. I was certain I hadn't left any notes, and I certainly hadn't received anyone today. I thought maybe it was a prank from one of the neighbors, though it seemed a bit too creepy for that. Still, I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just some odd coincidence. I tossed the note aside and went to the bathroom, thinking a shower would clear my head. But the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't quite place. When I came out of the bathroom, I froze. The front door was wide open. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of it. My heart began to pound as I quickly moved toward the door, my eyes scanning the dim hallway outside. There was no sign of anyone, but I felt a creeping sensation crawling up my spine. Slowly, I stepped back inside and shut the door, locking it once more. The apartment was eerily quiet, but something felt different now. As if there was an unfamiliar presence in the air, something just out of sight. I felt the urge to check the windows, but instead, I decided to make sure everything was in place. Reassure myself that nothing was out of the ordinary. I was halfway through double-checking when I heard it. A soft, slow knock at the door. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The sound wasn't loud, just the faintest rapping, but it was there. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I couldn't move. Was it someone from downstairs? Or perhaps the building's maintenance? But no, I hadn't heard anything outside, and the building had been quiet all night. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. No one was there. I backed away, my mind racing. I wanted to call the police, but the thought of them laughing at me for something so trivial made me hesitate. I wasn't even sure anything had happened. Maybe it was just my imagination, the stress from the trip making me paranoid. Then the knocking started again. This time harder. More insistent. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone, ready to call for help. But as I dialed, the apartment light flickered and then went out completely. I stood in complete darkness, heart hammering, my breath coming in short gasps. Suddenly, I heard another sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, the sound of something dragging, scraping along the floor. It was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around and my blood ran cold. A figure stood in the corner of the living room, just outside the edge of the dim kitchen light. A person. I could barely make out the shape, tall, thin, and completely still. They were facing the wall, almost as if they were waiting for something. "Who are you?" My voice was barely a whisper, my throat dry. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me. Then it slowly turned its head. The face was pale, almost sickly, and the eyes. Those eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them, just pure blackness. The dark, hollow gaze was enough to paralyze me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. "You weren't supposed to see me," the figure whispered, its voice ragged and low, almost like a breeze passing through broken glass. I felt a wave of coldness flood through me. The air felt thick, oppressive. The figure began to move toward me, its long arms stretching unnaturally. I snapped out of my paralysis and bolted for the door. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly fumbled the lock, but finally I managed to throw the door open and run out into the hallway. I didn't even think, I just ran down the stairs out into the street. The rain was coming down hard, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I looked back toward the building, but there was no sign of the figure. I took out my phone and called the police, my voice shaky as I explained the situation. When they arrived, they searched the apartment, but found nothing. No sign of forced entry. No one hiding. Just the empty, quiet apartment. The officer tried to calm me down, suggesting I might have been hallucinating due to exhaustion. They found the note, but it was gone by the time they checked it. There was no record of anyone entering my apartment, and when they searched the building, no one seemed out of place. But the worst part came later that night when I checked my phone. There was a new message sent after I had left the apartment. "I'm still waiting." I had just finished a hectic week and decided to spend a few days at my uncle's cabin to relax. away from the noise. The cabin is located deep in a forest, with no one around except for trees and wild animals. I remembered spending some peaceful weekends there with my family when I was younger, and now I planned to be alone. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered, simple but cozy with wooden floors and walls, and outside was a thick canopy of trees. As evening fell, the sky darkened and the wind and rain began to pick up. I lit the fireplace, made a cup of tea, and settled in to enjoy a quiet night. Around 8 p.m. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a book, listening to the sounds of the storm. Then I heard a faint tapping against the window. It was so soft I almost ignored it, thinking it was just the wind brushing the glass. But then I heard it again. This time it was clearer, rhythmic tapping. I set the book down and walked over to the window, peeking through the gap in the curtain. Nothing was there, just the dark forest and rain trickling off the eaves. Maybe it was just my imagination. I turned to walk back to the couch, but then the branches outside the window suddenly shook violently. I froze, a chill running down my spine. I stepped closer to the window and gently lifted the curtain. Everything seemed eerily still outside. The wind had stopped, the rain had slowed, and the surroundings were silent. Just as I was about to lower the curtain, I noticed something, muddy footprints near the bottom of the window, as if someone had just stepped there. My heart raced. My mind started to spiral. Had someone broken into my cabin, or, worse yet, was someone lurking outside watching me? I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no network, no cell service. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a neighbor, or maybe I was just overthinking it. Then I heard footsteps outside the door, slowly drawing closer. My heart pounded as I gripped my phone, my fingers cold and tight. I crept over to the door, peeking through the gap, and saw a figure standing in front of the door, motionless. The person didn't knock, didn't make a sound. They just stood there waiting for something. A wave of dread swept over me and I froze in place. The figure was too vague to make out clearly, but it seemed to be wearing a tattered coat, their head lowered, making their face almost impossible to see. My mind went blank, my fingers numb. Finally, I decided I had to know who this person was. I grabbed a wooden stick from behind me and quietly moved to the window, trying to sneak a look. The figure was still standing at the door, seemingly unaware that I was watching from a distance. Then, suddenly, they lifted their head. I froze. Their face, I couldn't even begin to describe it. Their skin was so pale it seemed almost transparent, with no distinct features, just a massive mouth that stretched unnaturally wide, almost from ear to ear. The face was empty, hollow, like it didn't belong to this world. My heart nearly stopped. I stumbled back, but at that moment I kicked a chair, making a loud noise. The figure immediately turned around and vanished into the darkness. I bolted for the back door, desperate to escape. Just as I opened the door, I heard a low, guttural laugh from behind me. The sound was not human, coming from somewhere far off, yet unmistakably clear. I ran into the rain-soaked night, the world around me pitch black. I couldn't tell where I was going, completely lost. My feet slipped in the mud and I nearly fell. When I finally broke free of the trees, I realized I had no idea where I was. Everything looked unfamiliar. Just as I was about to give up, I turned around and there it was, the figure again, standing far off in the distance. That same face, still contorted and blurry. A cold wave of terror washed over me, and I turned to run, my legs burning with exhaustion. As I was about to escape the forest, something stopped me. The figure appeared right in front of me, blocking my path, the face still as empty and monstrous as ever. It didn't move. It just stood there waiting. I didn't stop. I couldn't. With every last bit of strength, I pushed past it, stumbling out of the forest and onto a nearby road. I looked back. Nothing. Only wind and rain, and an eerie silence that stretched for miles. But when I finally made it back to the city, soaked and muddy, and looked into the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the back of my neck, were the unmistakable prints of fingers, cold, unnatural, as though something had touched me. That's when I realized I had escaped, but whatever that thing was, it never left. I was on a road trip, trying to unwind after a long, stressful year. My destination was a small town, but I'd taken the scenic route to stretch the trip out a little longer. It was late in the evening when I realized I had no cell service, and the winding roads through the countryside were getting darker and narrower. The occasional sign for a gas station or diner flashed by, but they were few and far between. At some point, I found myself on a stretch of road that seemed completely desolate. No other cars, no lights, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees. I'd been driving for hours, and the only sound was the hum of my tires against the asphalt and the steady beat of my headlights cutting through the black night. Then I saw it. A small, run-down motel by the side of the road. The neon sign above it flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. It wasn't ideal, but I needed to rest, and there wasn't anything else around for miles. So, I pulled into the lot and parked my car. The place had a certain unsettling vibe about it, like something was just off. The windows of the office were dark, but the door creaked open as I approached. A faint bell jingled as I stepped inside, and the smell of stale cigarettes and cheap cleaning products hit me immediately. The room behind the counter was dimly lit, and a man sat hunched over, filling out paperwork. He didn't look up when I entered, and for a moment I just stood there, unsure if I should say something or wait. The man had a scruffy beard, a flannel shirt, and a cap that looked a few sizes too small for his head. His hands moved slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. Hey, I said, clearing my throat. I need a room for the night." He glanced up then, but not with the kind of friendliness I was expecting. His eyes were cold, vacant, like he was looking through me rather than at me. He motioned toward the register without a word, and I signed in, trying not to let the tension in the room get to me. "Room 5, he muttered, almost like an afterthought. "It's at the end of the hall." He handed me a rusty key, the metal tarnished and worn. I nodded and left quickly, eager to escape the strange man's stare. The hallway was quiet and the air smelled of mildew. As I walked to the end of the hall, I noticed that every door except for mine was closed tight. No lights, no movement. When I entered the room, it was exactly what I expected, bare bones. A small bed, a faded carpet, and a few pieces of worn furniture. I locked the door behind me and placed my bag on the floor, feeling a sense of unease settle in my stomach. I'd stayed in far worse places, but something about this motel felt wrong. I tried to brush off the feeling. Maybe it was just exhaustion. But when I turned on the lamp beside the bed, something caught my eye, something scratched into the wall. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but as I leaned closer, I saw the word, "Leave." I froze. I stared at it for a long moment, wondering if it had been there all along or if I was just imagining things. I tried to convince myself it was just graffiti or a strange mark left by the last tenant. But the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I became. There was no way to ignore it now. Suddenly, the sound of the air conditioner kicked on, making a loud, rattling noise. I jumped, my heart pounding. I walked over to the window and glanced out, but there was nothing to see except darkness. I tried to shake it off. I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, but I couldn't relax. The room felt too quiet, too still. After a while, I got up and went to the door, half thinking I might just leave and find another place. But when I turned the handle, it wouldn't budge. I twisted it again, harder this time, but it was stuck. Panic began to rise in my chest. I pulled at the door, but it wouldn't open, as if something was blocking it from the other side. I pounded on it with my fists, yelling for help, but no one answered. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound from behind me. A low, dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My blood ran cold. I slowly turned around, my breath catching in my throat. At the far end of the room, the closet door was slightly ajar. From inside, a figure emerged, pale, gaunt, with a grotesque, twisted face. It looked wrong. Like a person, but not. Its eyes were wide and hollow, its mouth twisted into a grimace of agony. It didn't move at first, just stood there watching me. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, unable to look away. Then it opened its mouth, and a whisper came out, barely audible, yet chillingly clear. "You shouldn't have stayed." I snapped out of my trance and bolted for the window. I slammed my body into it, desperate to escape. The glass shattered with a loud crash and I fell into the dirt outside. Without looking back, I ran, my breath coming in frantic gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped in, started the engine, and sped away as fast as I could. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station to gather my bearings. I tried calling the motel, but the phone rang without an answer. The gas station attendant gave me a strange look when I mentioned the place, and he said, "That motel's been closed for years. It burned down back in '89. I stared at him, my mind racing, trying to process what he had just said. I told him what had happened. The strange man, the locked door, the figure. He nodded slowly, his expression grave. "No one's ever been able to stay there for long. They say the place is cursed. Anyone who stays, never leaves." I didn't know what to believe anymore. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going back to that motel. Ever. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. That maybe I'd never truly escaped. I was just a few hours into my solo camping trip when the rain started. It came out of nowhere, dark clouds rolling in quickly, drowning the sun in a matter of minutes. I had picked a remote spot in the woods, far from any roads or trails. It felt like the perfect place to disconnect, to enjoy the quiet. But as the downpour began, I realized I hadn't prepared for the weather change. I didn't even have a tarp, so I hurriedly set up my tent, trying to block the water from soaking through. By the time the storm really hit, it was too late. The wind howled through the trees, bending branches and sending leaves swirling through the air. My little tent shook under the pressure, and rain pelted against the fabric like 1,000 tiny fists. I tried to sleep, but the noise was deafening, and the tension in the air was thick with something else, a strange unease that crawled over my skin. At around midnight, I woke up to something that wasn't the storm. It was a sound, a rustling from just outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just another animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard it again. This time it was more deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving around my tent, careful but not trying to hide. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The wind outside was still fierce, but this sound cut through it, sharp and unnerving. I could hear footsteps, slow, dragging, like someone wasn't quite sure how to walk. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it at the door of the tent. The light trembled in my hand as the steps continued, now closer, almost on top of me. My heart was pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my throat was tight with fear. I took a slow, careful breath and unzipped the flap just a little, peeking out. The rain was coming down so hard that it was almost impossible to see beyond the small circle of light cast by my flashlight. But then, just at the edge of the light, I saw movement. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. But as it stepped closer, I could see it clearly. Someone or something tall and unnaturally thin, moving with an awkward lurch. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched in a strange, unsettling way. It was dressed in ragged clothes that looked like they'd been torn by branches or something worse. But what chilled me most was its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where the face should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless surface. The skin looked stretched, pale and glossy, like it had been peeled off and placed back on wrong. There was no mouth, no eyes, just a blank expanse. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body refused to obey, my mind reeling in panic. It stopped right in front of my tent, standing perfectly still. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other through the thin fabric of the tent. I could hear its breathing, shallow, ragged, like it was struggling to stay upright. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It reached out with one of its long, bony fingers and lightly tapped on the side of my tent. The sound echoed in my head like a drumbeat. The moment I heard that sound, something inside me snapped. I didn't think, I just acted. I grabbed my things, everything I could carry, and ripped open the tent. Without looking back, I ran into the storm, my legs burning, my chest tight with terror. The rain soaked me instantly, but I didn't care. I sprinted through the trees, not sure where I was going, only knowing that I had to get away. The sound of the figure's footsteps followed me, slow, dragging, like it was taking its time. It wasn't in any hurry. It knew it could catch me whenever it wanted. I didn't stop running. I pushed through thick underbrush, my limbs aching, the rain stinging my face. The storm only seemed to grow worse, the trees bending with the force of the wind. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. I was exhausted and I was lost. Then out of nowhere, the sound stopped. The footsteps stopped. I slowed, trying to catch my breath, the silence pressing down on me. The rain had slowed, but the air was thick and heavy, like something was watching. Something was waiting. I turned around slowly, my heart still racing. I scanned the darkness, expecting to see the figure looming in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the endless trees and the lingering echo of the storm. For a moment, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined it, that I had been hearing things in the rain, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I looked down at my hands, trembling from fear, I saw something that made my stomach drop. What? And blood. I wiped my fingers on my pants, but the red marks didn't come off. Suddenly, a feeling of dread washed over me. I wasn't alone. The sound came again. Faint but unmistakable. A dragging step, then another. Closer this time. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the dark, endless woods, and the feeling that something was behind me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I ran again, my legs refusing to stop, my mind blank except for one thought. I needed to escape. Somehow I stumbled back onto the main trail, exhausted, soaking wet, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized the sound had followed me all the way there. When I looked at the windshield, I saw the outline of the figure pressed against the glass. I drove away, not looking back. And I haven't gone camping since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the dragging sound just at the edge of my hearing, like something following me, waiting for me to stop running. And no matter how fast I go, it's always there. I was driving back from a business trip when I took the wrong exit off the highway. I wasn't lost, not really, but I had ended up on a small, winding road that seemed to go nowhere. There were no other cars, no street lights, just me, the endless stretch of asphalt, and the dense forest creeping in on both sides. It felt like the kind of road that people took when they didn't want to be found. I checked my phone, no signal. Typical considering the area. I figured I'd just keep driving, find a place to turn around, and head back to the main road. But as I drove deeper, something began to feel off. There were no houses, no signs of life, just trees. It was as if the whole world had been swallowed up by the dark forest. After what felt like an hour, I saw something up ahead. A light, faint but distinct, in the distance. My first instinct was relief, thinking it was another car or maybe a gas station. As I got closer, the light grew stronger, and soon I could make out the outline of a building, a dilapidated old farmhouse. I slowed down and pulled into the overgrown driveway, unsure of whether I should stop or just keep driving. The house looked abandoned. Windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged like it was on the verge of collapsing. But the light, it wasn't coming from the house itself. It was coming from a small shed out back, tucked behind the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. Maybe I could find someone to ask for directions or at least use a phone. I walked up to the shed, the light flickering eerily like a candle in the wind. There was no sign of any cars parked nearby, no one around. The shed was old, covered in moss and vines, but the light was clearly coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Something wasn't right, but I told myself it was probably just a weird rural thing. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, this time louder, and the door creaked open slightly. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped forward, pushing the door open. The inside was dim, lit only by that strange, flickering light. But what I saw inside made me freeze. There was a man, sitting in a rocking chair facing the wall. His clothes were torn, his hair matted with dirt. His face was pale, gaunt, as if he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge that I had opened the door. The light, I realized, was coming from a single candle on the floor beside him. As I took a step closer, I noticed something even worse. There was a pile of what looked like old photographs scattered around the shed, their edges curled and yellowed with age. I bent down to get a closer look, and my stomach twisted when I saw what was on them. They were pictures of the house, of the shed. But the most disturbing part was the faces in the photos. The people in them were the same as the man sitting in the chair, but their eyes were wrong, blank, empty. It was like they were hollow, as if someone had erased their souls. I stepped back, a wave of nausea rising in my chest. I turned to leave, but the man in the chair, without moving, whispered something. It was barely audible, but the words seemed to crawl under my skin. "Don't leave." I froze again, every muscle in my body locking up. My heart raced as I turned to face him. His head had tilted slightly, as though he was listening to something, but his eyes never moved from the corner of the room. "Please, don't leave," he repeated, his voice even quieter this time. I couldn't think. I didn't know what to do. The air in the shed grew thick, suffocating, like I was standing in a place that had been forgotten by time itself. I grabbed the door handle, ready to run, when I heard something even more chilling. A faint rhythmic tapping on the walls, coming from the dark corners of the shed. I turned to see where the sound was coming from, but the shadows were too deep. It was then I noticed that the photographs on the floor were moving. Slowly, one by one, they slid across the floor toward the man in the rocking chair. His hollow eyes never left the wall. My pulse thudded in my ears as I backed out of the shed, trying not to make a sound. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I turned and ran back to my car, my legs weak beneath me. The rain had started to fall again, and the world outside was pitch black, the trees looming like sentinels. I didn't look back as I drove away, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I floored the gas pedal, trying to put as much distance between myself and the shed as I could. It wasn't until I hit the main road, still a few miles away from the farmhouse, that I looked in the rearview mirror. The house was gone. Completely gone. The driveway was empty, and there was no sign of the shed. I almost stopped, but the instinct to get away from there was overwhelming. I kept driving, my mind spinning with the images of the man, the photographs, and that empty, hollow feeling that had been crawling under my skin ever since I walked into that shed. I finally reached a gas station, but when I went inside to get something to drink, the clerk gave me a strange look. I didn't think much of it until I overheard a conversation with another customer. "Crazy thing," the customer was saying. "You know that old farmhouse on Road 47? They say it's been abandoned for years. People used to live there, but no one's seen them in a long time. Not since the last family went missing." I froze. "Funny thing," the clerk replied. "People still say they see the old man sometimes, sitting out front like he's waiting for someone to come by." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My mouth went dry and I felt that cold shiver run up my spine. That night, as I tried to sleep in a hotel miles away, I kept seeing the images of the photographs in my head. The hollow faces, the tapping on the walls, the man's whispers. I thought about that dark corner of the shed where I hadn't dared look. And that's when I realized there was another photograph I hadn't seen. The one at the very end. It was a picture of me, taken from the window of my car. And there, at the very edge of the frame, was the old man, his hollow eyes staring directly at me. I had just moved into a new apartment, looking forward to the fresh start after a tough year. The place was old but cheap, and that's all I cared about. It was in a quiet part of the city, a building tucked between two other high-rises that had seen better days. I didn't expect much, just a safe place to sleep and a little space to call my own. The first few days were uneventful. The apartment was cramped but cozy, and I spent my evenings unpacking, making it feel more like home. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. I first noticed it on the second night. I had just finished dinner and was relaxing on the couch, scrolling through my phone. Then I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the wall behind me. I froze, thinking it was just the house settling. But the tapping didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone was knocking, but gently. I stood up, walked over to the wall, and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything from the other side. Shrugging it off, I went to bed. But the next night it happened again. And the next. The tapping seemed to grow louder, and sometimes it even sounded like scratching, like someone, or something, was trying to get through the wall. The odd thing was, it wasn't coming from the neighboring apartment, it was coming from the wall itself, like something deep inside the structure of the building. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the plumbing or maybe some animal in the walls. But then one evening it stopped being just noise. I was sitting on the couch again when I heard a soft, barely audible whisper from the wall. "Help me." I jumped up, my heart racing. My mind spun. Was I hearing things? Or was there someone on the other side of the wall, trapped? I stood there, frozen, listening. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Please help me." I rushed to the door of the apartment next to mine and knocked, but no one answered. The hallway was eerily silent. I felt a strange sense of dread, like something was wrong, like I had just uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat up in bed, wide awake, the whisper still echoing in my mind. And then it came again. This time louder, more urgent. "Please, you have to help me." I grabbed my phone and called the landlord. He sounded irritated when I explained the noises, but agreed to send someone to check the building the next day. I tried to sleep but woke up to the sound of something scraping against the wall, like nails on glass. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, the apartment suffocating me. When the maintenance man finally showed up, I explained everything. He didn't seem surprised though. In fact, he almost looked relieved. "Yeah, we've had complaints about this apartment before," he said without much emotion. "Some of the tenants say they hear things at night. It's probably just an old building, settling or something." I didn't believe him. But what else could I do? I asked him to look inside the wall, and after a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his tools and started taking off a panel near the corner of the living room. When the panel came loose, a gust of cold air hit me and I stepped back instinctively. The maintenance man reached inside the wall and pulled something out. It was a small, old-fashioned doll. A porcelain doll, its face cracked, eyes wide open, staring blankly into the room. He frowned. "Someone must have stuffed this in there," he muttered. "No wonder you're hearing things." He tossed the doll aside, but I didn't feel any better. In fact, I felt worse. There was something about the doll that made my skin crawl, like it was watching me. The maintenance man left shortly after, assuring me that it was just a random thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. That night, the whispers didn't stop. They were louder, now coming from all directions, filling the room. It sounded like they were right next to me, surrounding me. "Help me," over and over like a chant. The walls began to creak, the floor vibrating beneath me. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed out of the apartment, running down the stairs and into the street. The city felt like a safer place, even in the dark. I spent the night at a hotel, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed me. The next morning, I decided to return to the apartment just to grab my things and get out of there for good. When I walked in, everything seemed normal at first. The apartment was quiet, the whispers gone. But then I looked at the wall where the panel had been removed. The porcelain doll was back, placed neatly in front of the opening. Its eyes were no longer blank. They were watching me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to pry the door open. Behind me, I heard a faint scraping sound like nails on wood. I spun around, and the doll was moving, inching closer, its cracked face twisted in a grotesque smile. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't from the walls. They were coming from the doll. "Help me, please, help me." I screamed, trying to push the door open with all my strength. The doll's head tilted to the side, and its eyes followed me, unwavering. I couldn't escape fast enough. By the time I finally managed to get out, the door slammed shut behind me. I ran down the stairs and out into the street, gasping for air, but when I looked back at the building, it was gone. The apartment, the doll, the whispers, the entire building was gone. All that was left was an empty lot. I've never been able to explain it, but I know one thing for sure. The next tenant won't be so lucky. That night, the storm arrived suddenly. I was driving down an old, desolate highway with heavy rain pouring down, and the headlights barely illuminated anything beyond a few feet. There were no street lights, and the darkness around me felt like an endless void, save for the sound of tires skidding on the wet road. I still had about 20 miles to go to reach the secluded cabin in the woods. It was close to midnight, and I decided to push on, as turning back seemed too far and finding shelter wasn't an option. Just as I glanced away from the road and into the rearview mirror, I noticed a faint light ahead, flickering like something was ahead. I slowed down, curious, and as I got closer, I saw it wasn't a car but a person standing in the middle of the road. A figure dressed in a tattered coat, wearing a hat, standing motionless in the storm, seemingly unaffected by the harsh weather. A chill ran through me. My car slowed to a crawl as I veered to the side of the road. I hesitated but finally decided to approach the stranger. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, but he didn't respond. As I got closer, I saw he was expressionless, standing straight, with his arms hanging at his sides. His coat was filthy, almost unrecognizable, and beneath the hat, I could barely make out a pale face. I felt uneasy but pushed on. "Are you all right?" I asked again, voice shaking. Still no reply. When I got close enough, I saw a thin rope tied around his neck, the other end fastened to a tree. My heart stopped. I froze. Something wasn't right. The tension in the air thickened. I backed away slowly, ready to get in my car, but then I heard a strange rustling sound coming from the woods behind me. My pulse quickened and I turned around, expecting to see something. Nothing but the storm. When I turned back to the man, he finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, like it came from deep in the earth. "You can't leave." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. "Why?" I managed to ask. He slowly raised a hand, pointing into the woods. "It's coming." I turned to look into the dark trees, but the rustling had stopped. The woods were still, the only noise was the constant drumming of the rain. Suddenly, the man's eyes turned sharp, empty sockets seeming to pierce into me. In a voice colder than the storm, he warned, "If you want to live, leave now." I spun around and nearly ran to my car. As I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I dared a glance over my shoulder. There was nothing. Just the dark, endless rain. I quickly jumped into the car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. My heart raced as I sped down the highway, the headlights cutting through the rain. Though I was now speeding away, the unease didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Just as I thought I had escaped, my phone suddenly buzzed. The screen displayed no caller ID, only a short text. "It's already behind you." I froze, turning to look in the rearview mirror. There was only darkness, nothing else. I forced myself to calm down, closing my eyes to steady my breathing. I kept driving, my hands trembling. By the time I left the forest and reached the more open road, everything seemed to return to normal. But I couldn't forget the text. I couldn't forget what the man had said. When I got home and parked the car, I noticed something strange. On the back seat, lying perfectly still, was a thin rope. It was a quiet night. The kind where everything seems still, as if the world itself has taken a deep breath and paused. I was sitting in my living room, the only light coming from the flickering television, when I noticed something strange. My neighbor, Mrs. Carter, lived across the hall. She was an elderly woman who had lived in the building for years, and we would often exchange polite greetings in passing. But tonight, as I glanced out of my apartment window into her apartment across the hall, I realized something unusual. The lights in her apartment were on, but the blinds were drawn tight, blocking any view inside. This wasn't strange in itself. Mrs. Carter was a private person, but it was unusual for her to be home at this hour. Curiosity gnawed at me and I watched for a while. Then I saw it. A shadow moving behind the blinds. It wasn't a silhouette of a person. It was something different, a shifting, twisting shape, like a dark cloud moving across the window. My pulse quickened, but I shrugged it off as a trick of the light or perhaps a shadow from the street lamp. But then it happened again, and this time I could see it more clearly. The shape was unnerving. It seemed to jerk around, shifting erratically, almost as if it was trying to escape. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a cold, creeping sensation that I couldn't shake. I watched the window intently for a few minutes, but the shadow didn't move again. I decided to knock on Mrs. Carter's door. Maybe she was feeling unwell, or perhaps something had happened. I could hear her usual soft footsteps as I approached the door, but when I knocked, there was no answer. I knocked again, this time more firmly, but still nothing. It was as if she wasn't home at all. I felt an uneasy tension rising in my chest, the odd sensation that something wasn't right. I walked back to my apartment and decided to call her. The phone rang several times, but then a faint click came from the other side, followed by a strange silence. I said her name into the receiver, but there was no response, just the sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. I hung up, my mind racing with unsettling thoughts. That's when I heard it, a soft thud from across the hall. It was faint but distinct, like something heavy falling to the floor. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The building was silent, aside from the occasional creak of the old structure. I stepped cautiously toward Mrs. Carter's door again, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Suddenly, the door clicked open on its own. I was stunned. Mrs. Carter had never left her door unlocked. Hesitating for only a moment, I pushed the door gently, and it creaked open. Inside, the apartment was strangely dim, the faint glow of lamps casting long shadows across the room. The air was musty, stale, as if no one had been there for days. I stepped further in, calling out softly for Mrs. Carter, but there was no answer. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of an old fridge in the corner. As I moved deeper into the apartment, something caught my eye, a photo frame knocked over on the coffee table. It was odd because Mrs. Carter always kept her place neat. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I saw the picture. It was of her, sitting with a younger man, smiling happily. But something about the image felt off. Then I heard a soft sound behind me. A shuffle, a slight scrape against the floor. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. There, standing in the doorway to the bedroom, was Mrs. Carter. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at me with an intensity one had never seen before. She wasn't smiling, wasn't speaking, she was simply watching me. Before I could say anything, she slowly lifted her hand and pointed toward the bedroom. My blood ran cold. Her finger was unnaturally stiff, as if she was trying to communicate without words. I backed away, slowly, instinctively, toward the door. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her gaze, the way she seemed to follow me with every step. Just as I reached the door, I heard her whisper, just barely, a sound so soft I thought I had imagined it. "He's still here." I turned and bolted down the hall, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When I reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily, trying to process what had just happened. The next day, I went back to check on Mrs. Carter. Her door was wide open, the apartment empty. The only thing left inside was the picture frame, still lying on the coffee table, the photo of her and the young man with a crack across the glass. Mrs. Carter was never seen again. Some say she simply vanished, as though she had never existed. Others believe she was taken, but the truth is, I'll never know. What I do know is that sometimes, when I walk past that apartment, I still feel her eyes on me, watching, waiting. It was a cold evening when I first noticed the strange door in the old building I had just moved into. The building itself was ancient, with creaky floors and long, dark hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Most of the apartments were empty, and the few residents who remained kept to themselves. I had found the place at a bargain price, which, at the time, seemed like a stroke of luck. The door in question was on the ground floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that led to nowhere. It was old, with a tarnished brass handle and a faded wooden frame. There was no nameplate on the door, no indication of who or what might be behind it. The weirdest part was that it was always locked. No one ever went in or out, and I had never seen any signs of activity from that direction. The first few days I didn't think much of it. The building was full of oddities, and I assumed it was just another one of those peculiarities. But then something happened that made me begin to wonder if I was living in a place I didn't fully understand. One evening, as I was coming back to my apartment after work, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. Just a crack, barely noticeable, but enough to make me pause. I stood in front of it for a long moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Was I imagining things? Or had someone been inside? I pushed the door open a little further, my heart beating faster. The room beyond was dark, save for a faint light from a flickering bulb overhead. It was an odd sight, an old storage room that smelled musty and damp. There were piles of cardboard boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, and dust everywhere. But as I stepped inside, my foot caught on something. I looked down and saw a small rusted key lying on the floor. My curiosity got the better of me and I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. It didn't seem to belong to anything in the room, nor did it look like it would fit any of the doors I had seen. I slipped it into my pocket, my mind still spinning with questions. What was the key for? Why had it been lying there, hidden among the dust? The next night I went back to the door. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I knew I couldn't stop thinking about it. I stood in front of the door, key in hand, and before I could hesitate, I inserted the key into the lock. It clicked open as if it had been waiting for me. The door creaked on its hinges and I stepped into the darkness beyond. The room was even more unnerving up close. It was small, barely furnished, and the walls were covered in peeling wallpaper. There was a single bed in the corner, its sheets disheveled as if someone had recently slept there. But the most disturbing thing was the walls. They were covered in strange, jagged symbols, scratched deeply into the paint, as though someone had been trying to carve something into them over and over again. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I walked further into the room. I couldn't explain why, but it felt like I was being watched. My breath quickened, and I suddenly felt as though the air was thick with something unseen. As I turned to leave, I heard something behind me. It was a soft whisper, like the sound of someone trying to speak but unable to form words. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, silent, save for the hum of the overhead light. But the air had changed. It was colder now, and I could feel the presence of something that didn't belong in that room. Without thinking, I rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I stood in the hallway, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what had just happened. Was it just my imagination, or had I stumbled onto something far darker than I had realized? The next day, I told one of my neighbors about the room and the key. She looked at me with wide eyes, her face pale. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she said. "That door's been locked for years. No one is supposed to go in." "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She looked around as if making sure no one else was listening, then leaned in closer. "They say there's something in there. Something that's not human. Whoever went in there last never came out." I didn't know whether to believe her or not, but the fear in her eyes was real. And that's when I realized I wasn't the first person to have noticed the door. It had been there, locked and hidden, for a reason. I never went back to that door after that day. The key I had found, I threw it away. I didn't want to know what it opened. And as for the room, it remains locked. Every time I walk past it, I can't help but feel that there is something inside, waiting for someone else to make the mistake I did. And maybe, just maybe, it's still waiting for the next curious soul to unlock it. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. I'd booked a secluded cabin through an Airbnb, far from the chaos of the city, nestled deep in the woods. The listing promised solitude, fresh air, and a peaceful retreat, just what I needed after a stressful month at work. I arrived late in the evening as the sun was dipping below the horizon, and the clouds were gathering in the sky. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of my car as I pulled up to the cabin, which looked just like the photos, rustic, charming, and surrounded by tall, shadowy trees. It was the kind of place that made you feel both at peace and a little uneasy, like nature was both a comfort and a reminder of how small you were. The rain started falling shortly after I unloaded my bags into the cabin. The storm rolled in fast, with thunder cracking and lightning illuminating the sky. I made myself comfortable in the living room, lit a fire in the stone fireplace, and opened a bottle of wine. The sound of rain hitting the roof and the crackling of the fire gave the room an eerie yet calming atmosphere. At first, the storm felt cozy. But as the night wore on, the cabin grew colder, the wind howling outside as the trees swayed violently. I wrapped myself in a blanket and curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. It was then I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps outside. I paused, phone in hand, listening intently. There was nothing, just the sound of the storm. I shrugged it off as the wind making the trees creak. But a few minutes later, the sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps dragging through the wet ground. They stopped just outside the door. My heart started racing. The cabin was isolated. I had seen no other cars on the way in. Who could be out there? I got up cautiously, peering through the window, but all I could see were sheets of rain and the dark silhouette of the woods. There was no one there. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, maybe some animals in the woods. Still, unease lingered in my chest, and I locked the front door before returning to the couch. The hours passed and the storm grew worse, the wind howling louder. But it wasn't just the storm I could hear anymore. There were whispers, faint at first as if carried by the wind, but they became clearer. It sounded like a conversation in a language I didn't recognize, coming from outside the walls of the cabin. I stood up again, heart pounding, staring at the door. The voices were growing louder now, almost as if someone was just on the other side of the door, murmuring in low, urgent tones. I felt frozen, unsure whether to open the door and confront whatever was out there, or hide in the corner and pray it would go away. The whispers stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of something tapping gently against the window, soft, rhythmic, like fingers drumming. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtains back with shaking hands. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing. Just the darkness of the storm and the trees swaying in the wind. But the tapping continued. Soft, insistent. I backed away slowly, my mind scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was just my fear getting the best of me. But then I saw something. Through the glass, a pale face, faintly visible, eyes wide and unblinking, pressed against the window. I gasped, stumbling backward, heart racing. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was too surreal, too terrifying to comprehend. The face stayed there, still as a statue, watching me. Without thinking, I rushed to the front door, unlocked it, and swung it open with all my might. But the moment I stepped outside, I was hit with a wall of cold wind and rain. There was nothing there. No person. No sign of anyone at all. I stood there in the rain, trembling, soaked to the bone. The storm raged around me and the trees swayed ominously, but there was no one. No footsteps. No whispers. Just the relentless howl of the storm. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, locked inside, clutching my phone with white-knuckled fingers. Every noise, every creak of the house made me jump. The fear gnawed at me until, eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. When morning came, the storm had passed and the woods outside were silent. The sun was out and everything seemed perfectly normal. I told myself it had all been a product of my imagination. Too much isolation, too much darkness, too much fear. But as I prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. The front door, which I had locked and bolted shut, was slightly ajar. And in the corner of the cabin, where I had left my coat, was a single wet footprint on the floor, leading from the door to the fireplace. I didn't stay another night. I left the cabin early, leaving my bags behind, and never returned to that Airbnb again. The host later apologized for the weather, but when I asked about the cabin's history, they only said it had been abandoned for years before it was listed. They didn't mention anything about previous guests, but I didn't ask further. Sometimes, on stormy nights, I can still hear the faint tapping against my window, as if whatever was outside that cabin is still waiting. I had been dreaming of a solo camping trip for months. After weeks of sitting in an office, surrounded by noise and stress, the idea of being alone in the wilderness, with nothing but my thoughts and the sounds of nature, felt like the perfect escape. I found a remote campsite in a national forest, miles away from civilization, with only a few scattered trails and no cell phone signal. It seemed ideal. I arrived just as dusk was settling in, the sun dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp, and a faint mist began to rise from the ground as the temperature dropped. I set up my tent near a small clearing by a creek, the sound of running water creating a peaceful atmosphere. As I built a fire and settled in for the evening, I felt the quiet settle around me. It was a silence I had never experienced before, so deep, so all-encompassing that it almost felt unnatural. The crackling fire was the only noise, breaking the stillness of the night. I had brought a few books to read, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering, pulled into the silence, into the shadows that stretched out from the trees. The wind whispered through the leaves, but everything else was still. Too still. Just as I began to feel the weight of the isolation, I heard something. A distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. It was too soft to be an animal. My heart skipped a beat and I stood up, straining to hear. The rustling continued, moving closer, and my instincts told me I wasn't alone. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind. Or maybe some deer or other wildlife, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The rustling stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was silent again. I sat back down by the fire, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But the uneasy feeling remained, gnawing at the back of my mind. I poked the fire with a stick, hoping to chase away the tension, when I heard it again. This time much closer. A soft crunch of leaves underfoot. It was unmistakable. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the darkness, but saw nothing. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees, the shadows, the flickering light of the fire. I called out, my voice trembling, "Is anyone there?" The rustling stopped. Absolute silence followed. I was alone, I told myself. There was no one here. But still, that feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the edge of the light, lingered in the air like a thick fog. I decided to ignore it, retreating into my tent for the night. I zipped it up tightly, trying to block out the sounds of the forest, the stillness that had begun to feel oppressive. As I lay there, the only sound was the beating of my own heart and the occasional gust of wind. And then I heard it again. The soft crunching of leaves. Closer this time. I sat up in my sleeping bag, holding my breath, listening. The sound was unmistakable, a slow, deliberate movement like someone, or something, was circling my campsite. The trees outside my tent loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I told myself I was overreacting. It was probably another camper, someone who had wandered off the trail, lost in the woods. But something in my gut told me it was something else. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the flashlight again and shone it through the tent flap. The light illuminated the trees in front of me, casting long shadows on the ground. But nothing moved. There was no sign of anyone. I breathed a sigh of relief, telling myself I was being foolish. Maybe it was just my nerves. But as I lay back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air was thick with tension, and every crackle of the fire felt like a warning. Suddenly, a loud thud right outside my tent. I froze, my blood running cold. Something heavy had just struck the ground with force, like a fist pounding against the earth. I could hear it, the slow, steady breathing of something large, something not human, just beyond the canvas of my tent. My mind raced. I had no weapons, no means of defense. My phone was dead, and the closest ranger station was miles away. I was utterly alone. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it was almost right next to me. I reached for the zipper of the tent, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I needed to get out, to run, but I couldn't move. The fear had paralyzed me. Then, without warning, the tent flap was torn open. I screamed, scrambling backward, my flashlight falling to the ground. But there was nothing there. No creature, no person. Just the open night and the dense, dark forest surrounding me. I ran out of the tent, heart pounding, not caring where I went. I could barely see in the dark, but I ran through the woods, stumbling over rocks and roots, not looking back. I didn't stop running until I found the road, my legs burning with exhaustion. I flagged down a passing car, and they took me to the nearest town. The driver asked what I was doing out there, but I couldn't explain. How could I explain something I didn't fully understand? I never went camping again after that night. The forest, with its oppressive silence and those haunting, invisible eyes, still lingers in my mind. And though I tell myself I was just imagining things, overworked, overwhelmed, and far too isolated, part of me knows I'll never truly know what I encountered in the woods. What was out there watching, waiting? It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when the doorbell rang. I had just finished dinner, and the soft hum of the TV was the only sound in the apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I walked over to the door, curious but unbothered. When I opened it, there was no one there, just a small, unmarked box sitting on the doorstep. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't ordered anything, and there was no note, no indication of who had left it. I bent down and picked up the box. It was heavier than I had anticipated. I turned it over in my hands, checking for any writing, any label, but there was nothing. Just a plain cardboard box with no distinguishing features. I looked around, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby, but the hallway was empty, silent. With a shrug, I brought the box inside and closed the door behind me. The air in my apartment felt unusually still as I set the box on the kitchen counter. My curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a knife from the drawer to cut open the tape. It wasn't hard to slice through, and when the cardboard flaps opened, my stomach turned. Inside there was a small, weathered book. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle, the cover worn down from years of handling. At first, I thought it was some kind of antique or collector's item, but as I picked it up, something odd struck me. There was a name written on the inside cover in neat handwriting: to Claire. May this guide you. I froze. My name was Claire. I had never seen this book before in my life, nor could I think of anyone who would send it to me. I hadn't told anyone about my love for old books, or my interest in strange, forgotten things. So how could someone know? I flipped through the pages, each one filled with strange symbols and what appeared to be old, cryptic drawings. I couldn't make sense of it at first, but something about the pages seemed alive. The ink almost appeared to shift as I moved the book around in the light, and the drawings looked like they were staring at me. A chill ran down my spine, and I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding. I considered throwing it away, but the strange pull to it was overwhelming. I couldn't stop myself from opening it again. As I did, I noticed something that made my breath catch in my throat. A picture. A small black and white photograph tucked into the last page of the book. It was a photo of a woman standing alone in a forest, with a look of pure terror on her face. The image was strangely familiar, like I had seen it before, but I couldn't place where. I turned the book around, my hands shaking, but there was no more information. No clues, no answers. Just the silence of my apartment, closing in on me. That night I couldn't sleep. The weight of the book sat heavy on the kitchen counter, like it was waiting for something. I kept hearing sounds, soft, barely audible knocks, like someone was tapping on the walls or the window. I told myself it was nothing, just the old pipes or maybe the wind. But when I went to check the window, the blinds were drawn tightly, and there was no sign of anything outside. Still, that nagging sense of unease clung to me like a shadow. The next morning, I woke to find the book had moved. It was no longer on the kitchen counter, but sitting on my living room coffee table. I could have sworn I had left it where it was, but there it was, waiting for me. And the worst part? There was a new page open in the book, one I had never seen before. Written in bold, sharp ink, "You shouldn't have looked." I had been hiking for hours. The trail was long, winding through thick trees, the sun barely breaking through the canopy above. I had planned to spend the weekend camping alone, just to clear my head. The solitude was peaceful, and the quiet was exactly what I needed. But now, as the light began to fade and the air turned cooler, I realized I had wandered further off the main trail than I intended. My phone had no signal, of course. Why would it? I had wanted to disconnect after all. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but the forest looked the same in every direction. I'd have to find shelter before nightfall. Just as I was starting to feel a bit of panic, I saw it. A small cabin barely visible through the trees. It wasn't on any map I had seen, and it looked abandoned. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were boarded up, but there was something strange about it, like it had been forgotten, but not for long. I walked up cautiously, half expecting the door to be locked or the place to be completely derelict. But it wasn't. The door creaked open with a slight push. I hesitated, then stepped inside. The air inside was stale, the walls lined with cobwebs. The floor creaked beneath my boots as I moved into the dimly lit room. The only furniture was a single chair in the center of the room and a small wooden table. There was a faint smell of mildew and dust, but nothing alarming. I decided to stay for the night. It was better than setting up camp in the dark. I made a quick fire in the old stone fireplace and sat down on the chair, pulling out my backpack to get some food. As I ate, I noticed something odd. There was no sign of any recent activity in the cabin, yet it didn't feel abandoned for long. Something about the silence in the room felt wrong. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of the stillness pressing in around me, almost like the air itself was thickening. It was too quiet, too empty. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I was alone in a strange place and my mind was playing tricks. But then I heard it, a soft creak just behind me. At first I thought it was the old cabin settling, but it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was walking inside. I spun around, heart pounding. There was no one there. I stood up, my breath shallow. The firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the corners of the room. Nothing. I was alone, or so I thought. As I was about to sit back down, I noticed something in the corner of the room, a small, old-fashioned rocking chair. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't there when I first entered. The chair was gently rocking back and forth as if someone had just gotten up from it. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing. There had been no one in the room, no sign of anyone coming or going. Yet the chair was moving, slowly, rhythmically. I backed away toward the door, feeling a cold sweat on the back of my neck. That was when I heard the voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it came from somewhere behind me. Stay? I spun around, but there was no one. No movement. Nothing. I was alone. I had to be. The voice came again, louder this time, almost a plea. Stay? I could feel my heartbeat in my throat now. I bolted for the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the handle. It wouldn't open. I tried again, harder this time, panic rising in my chest. The door finally gave way with a loud crack, and I stumbled outside into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The forest was dark and silent again. No creaks, no voices. I ran as fast as I could, not looking back, not caring if I was going in the right direction. I just needed to get away from the cabin, from whatever was inside. I didn't stop until I reached the main trail, my legs aching from the sprint. My mind was a blur of fear. I thought I was safe. But as I caught my breath and looked back at the forest, something caught my eye. In the distance, the faint glow of the cabin's window. It wasn't just a reflection of moonlight. The light was moving, slowly, like someone, or something, was watching me from inside. I turned away and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still waiting for me, the cabin still calling me back. I would never return to that place. But I still wonder, who, or what, had been sitting in that rocking chair? And why had it wanted me to stay? It was late when I finally turned onto the long, winding road that led to my cabin. The day had been exhausting, and all I wanted was to relax in the quiet, isolated comfort of my place in the woods. The drive had been uneventful, and I'd only stopped once to grab a quick dinner from a small gas station along the highway. The sky had darkened quickly, and now the headlights of my car cut through the thickening darkness as I navigated the narrow gravel road. The trees on either side loomed like shadows, almost too close, their branches tangled together above. I didn't usually mind the isolation, but tonight it felt heavier. As I neared the cabin, I saw something ahead in the distance, a figure standing at the edge of the road just outside the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps a deer. But no. As I got closer, the figure didn't move. It was a man standing still, facing the woods, his back to me. I slowed the car, hesitant. It was odd to see someone out here this late in the middle of nowhere. He didn't seem to be moving at all, just standing there in the dark like he was waiting for something, or someone. I rolled down my window and called out, unsure of what to say. "Hey, you all right?" The man didn't respond. I waited, expecting him to turn around or acknowledge me, but there was nothing. No movement. Not even a shift in his posture. Something about it was off. I wasn't used to seeing people out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the thought of some random stranger in the woods this late gave me an uneasy feeling. I honked the horn once, louder this time, hoping to get his attention, but the man remained still, like he didn't even hear me. I thought about pulling over, offering help. But then I noticed something strange. His clothes were old, ragged, worn down, like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in tangled strands around his shoulders. But what struck me most was his face. It was pale, almost sickly white, and his eyes were vacant, hollow. It was as if there was no life in him at all. My stomach twisted. I decided to drive past. I wasn't going to risk getting out of the car and getting involved with someone who seemed so unnatural. But as I drove past, I felt something strange. The man didn't turn to look at me, but somehow I knew he was watching. I could feel it. His presence behind me, lingering in the dark. I pushed the gas pedal a little harder, but the sensation wouldn't leave. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. As I reached the cabin and parked the car, I glanced back toward the road. The man was still there, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. He hadn't moved an inch. His back was still to me, but his head was tilted slightly to the side, like he was listening, waiting. I quickly grabbed my things and rushed inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I tried to settle my nerves. The air inside was stale as usual, and the familiar smell of wood and pine soothed me for a moment. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, that the man outside wasn't just some lost wanderer. But it was hard to ignore the gnawing sense of dread creeping through my thoughts. I made a cup of tea, trying to settle my nerves. The cabin was quiet, save for the soft crackling of the wood in the fireplace. It wasn't until I sat down to watch TV that I heard it. A knock at the door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I had locked the door when I came inside, and I hadn't heard any footsteps. There was no way anyone could have gotten close to the cabin without me noticing. The knock came again, louder this time. I stood up slowly, my legs stiff, and walked cautiously to the door. My hand hovered over the handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The sound of that knock echoed in my ears, relentless, insistent. I glanced through the peephole. Nothing. Just darkness outside. The knocking continued, one after another, each louder than the last. I felt the walls of the cabin closing in on me. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted, but I couldn't stay in here anymore. My instinct told me to get out, to run, but my legs felt frozen to the spot. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear something, anything. But there was nothing. A long, agonizing silence. I turned away from the door, my pulse still racing, trying to convince myself it was just some prank. But then I heard it again. A faint scraping noise, like something, or someone, was dragging along the side of the cabin just outside the walls. I grabbed my phone, trying to dial the police, but there was no signal. Of course. I was in the middle of nowhere after all. I crept to the window and peeked outside, my heart pounding in my ears. I saw nothing. Then I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing just beyond the trees. The man from the road. He was facing the cabin now. His hollow eyes locked on mine, as if he knew I was watching him. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly he began to move toward the cabin. Slowly, deliberately. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. But how? I ran to the back door, only to find it had been locked from the outside. My heart sank. There was no way out. I turned back to the front door, but before I could move, I heard the sound of something heavy scraping against the wood. The man was right outside. I grabbed my jacket and rushed upstairs, trying to think of an escape route. But before I could reach the window, the door burst open, the hinges splintering under the force. There was no time to think. I ran through the house, out the back door, and into the woods, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster and faster. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, where a passing car finally pulled over and offered me a ride. But even as I sat in the car, safe for the moment, I couldn't shake the feeling. that sense of being watched. And the question that kept repeating in my mind, how did the man know I was there? How had he found me? I don't know if I'll ever return to that cabin, and part of me hopes I never will. It was one of those evenings when the rain never seemed to stop. It had been pouring for hours, and the sound of it hitting the windows and roof of the small cabin I was renting echoed throughout the rooms. I had come here for peace and quiet, hoping to escape the noise of the city and the chaos of my life for a weekend. A quiet retreat, just me and the forest. The cabin was small, rustic, and charming in its own way, perfect for a solo getaway. I had settled in easily, unpacked, made some tea, and curled up on the couch with a book. The kind of night where everything felt warm and safe, like nothing could possibly go wrong. That was until I heard the knock at the door. It was soft at first, almost as though it were part of the storm itself, just a light tapping. I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind or a branch hitting the wood. But then it came again, louder this time. A single, insistent knock. I frowned. Who could be out there in this weather? I wasn't expecting anyone. The cabin was in a remote area, miles away from any neighbors, and I had made sure to tell the rental agency that I'd be alone. I stood up from the couch and walked to the door, my heart pounding slightly, though I didn't know why. Peering through the peephole, I saw no one. Confused, I opened the door cautiously. The porch was empty, and the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the world outside. There wasn't a soul in sight. I stepped outside for a moment, scanning the surroundings, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the rain, and the distant sounds of the storm. No footsteps in the mud, no signs of anyone having been there. I shrugged it off. Probably just someone passing by, or maybe a strange trick of the wind. But as I closed the door, I felt the unsettling sensation that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I returned to my seat, trying to focus on my book again, but my mind kept drifting back to the door. My phone was on the coffee table, but the signal was spotty out here, and I had no reason to think anything was wrong. Still, a knot formed in my stomach. Suddenly, the knock came again. This time it was louder, more forceful. My breath caught in my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I hesitated. Was someone playing a prank on me? The thought didn't sit right. I had seen no one when I checked outside earlier, but the knocking wouldn't stop. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. As I approached the door, I noticed something else. The light from the hallway seemed dimmer than it had been moments ago, like someone had turned it off or the power had flickered. I reached for the doorknob, and just as my hand touched it, the door swung open by itself. Not a creak, not a groan, just a slow, deliberate opening. The wind had died down outside, and the rain had become almost eerily quiet. But the air was thick with something else now. Something heavy. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't. But against my better judgment, I stepped outside. There was someone standing there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow. Someone dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden beneath a hood. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized it wasn't just any person. This person was wrong. They were standing completely still, their face turned downward, and their hands hanging limp by their sides. The clothing they wore was old, frayed at the edges and torn in places. But it wasn't the clothes or the posture that unsettled me. It was their stillness, their utter lack of movement. I called out, my voice shaking. "Hello? Are you okay?" No response. No movement. I took a step forward, but then something strange happened. The wind picked up again, and with it, the rain started to pour down harder. But as the rain hit the figure's body, it didn't seem to touch them. It was as if they were absorbing the rain, standing there perfectly dry, while the world around them drowned. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know why I didn't run, why I didn't slam the door and lock it. It was like my feet were glued to the ground, my mind racing with confusion, fear, and disbelief. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it slowly lifted its head, revealing its face. I could barely make it out at first, but as the figure turned toward me, the air seemed to grow colder. It was a face, but not a face. Blank. Featureless. Just skin stretched over bone, eyes hollow and black like something was missing, like the person who had once worn that face was no longer inside. I screamed. The door slammed shut behind me. I didn't know how I got back inside, but there I was, pressed up against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pounding of the rain on the roof was deafening, drowning out everything else. And then there was silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but the silence only deepened. I didn't dare look outside again. Eventually, the rain slowed and the storm passed. But the oppressive weight in the air didn't lift. I stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, locked inside, too scared to sleep. The knocking didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never went away. The next morning I checked the door. There was nothing. No sign of anyone having been there. But I knew something was wrong. I had felt it, seen it, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget that face. I had been hiking alone for a few days, deep into a part of the forest I hadn't visited before. The air was fresh, the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional bird call. It was exactly what I needed after weeks of stress and exhaustion from work. The solitude felt like a balm, and each step away from civilization brought a strange peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The trail was narrow, barely visible in places, winding its way through thick underbrush. I had my compass and my map, and I made sure to keep track of where I was. I'd planned to camp at a secluded spot near a creek, just far enough from any other hikers that I could enjoy the quiet without being disturbed. By the time I reached the campsite, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The fading light painted the trees in soft, golden hues, and the air had cooled considerably. Setting up camp was routine. Pitch the tent, start a small fire, boil water for some freeze-dried food. I felt comfortable, alone but not lonely. Then, as the last light of day disappeared and the shadows grew long, I heard it. A voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, soft and distant, coming from the direction of the trail I had hiked earlier. Hello? Is anyone there? I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I listened again, but the voice didn't repeat. For a moment, I told myself it was just the wind, maybe someone else further along the trail. But then it came again, closer this time. Hello? Help me. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. The voice sounded desperate. Someone was out there. I had passed a few hikers earlier in the day, but I hadn't seen anyone for hours. I wasn't supposed to meet anyone out here, not this far from the main trail. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the path, trying to keep my footsteps quiet. The voice grew louder as I got closer, but it still sounded faint, like it was coming from someone far away. I moved faster, eager to find the source. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the thickening darkness, I reached a clearing. The moonlight illuminated the trees and the ground, and I could see nothing. No person, no sign of anyone having been there. The voice had stopped. I stood there, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night air. Nothing. My breath came in shallow bursts, and I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was an echo from someone farther down the trail. Or maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That's when I heard it again. This time, the voice was closer than ever, as though it was coming from just behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the air, but there was no one there. My pulse was pounding in my ears, the hair on my arms standing on end. Help, please, help me. I couldn't move. I had to find out what was happening, who or what was out there. The voice was so real, so tangible. But no matter how much I looked around, there was no one. The trees were still, the air thick with silence. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something was pulling me forward. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to the sound. Against my better judgment, I walked deeper into the forest. And then I saw him. A man standing in the clearing just beyond the trees. His back was to me, but his body was unnaturally stiff. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Are you okay? I asked, my voice shaking. There was something off about him, something that made my stomach tighten in fear. Slowly he turned around. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He stared at me, but his gaze was empty, vacant, like he wasn't really seeing me. "I can't find my way back," he said, his voice low and hoarse, barely audible over the sound of my heartbeat. His lips didn't move the way they should. It was like the words were being forced out. I tried to step closer, but my body froze as if my legs no longer belonged to me. The man just stood there staring. Where did you come from?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, fear settling into my bones. His gaze shifted slightly, but it was almost imperceptible. Then, in a voice colder than the night air, he said, "I'm lost too." Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, sending the hairs on my neck standing up. The forest seemed to grow even darker, the shadows shifting in unnatural ways. I couldn't look away from the man's face, but something inside me screamed that I needed to run. Without thinking, I turned and bolted in the opposite direction. My feet pounded against the forest floor as I sprinted back toward my campsite. I heard nothing behind me, no footsteps, no voice, just the rush of my own breath and the pounding of my heart. I didn't stop running until I reached my tent, and I didn't dare leave until the sun came up. The entire night was spent in a restless panic, eyes darting to the shadows, my ears straining to hear any sound that wasn't the wind. The next morning, I packed up and left the campsite early, too scared to stay a moment longer. I didn't want to think about the man I had seen, but the thought of him haunted me as I hiked back toward the trailhead. When I reached the main trail, I stopped at the ranger station to report what had happened. The ranger looked at me with confusion. "Sir," he said slowly, "you're the second person to report seeing someone like that in the woods this week. But there's something you should know." He paused, and his eyes flicked to the floor as if he didn't want to continue. "There's been no one lost out here. No one at all." I turned, my heart skipping a beat, and left without saying another word. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I can still see that man's empty stare, his lips barely moving as he said, "I'm lost too." I had always loved the idea of solitude, the kind that comes with being far from the distractions of modern life. So when I found an isolated cabin for rent on a quiet stretch of forest, I didn't hesitate. It was off the grid. No Wi-Fi, no signal, just nature surrounding me on all sides. Perfect for a few days of peace. When I arrived, the weather was perfect, but the cabin itself was far more run down than I had expected. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, with peeling paint and overgrown vines crawling up the sides. The front door was slightly ajar, and the wooden steps creaked beneath my weight as I approached. But something about it still felt inviting. After a long drive, I was ready to get out of my car and into the calm. Inside, the air smelled old, musty, with a faint scent of something stale. The furniture was sparse and dusty, but everything seemed to work. The wood stove was stocked with kindling, and the windows, though fogged with age, provided a nice view of the forest. I told myself it was just a bit of wear and tear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the forest, I heard a soft tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the glass, but the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. I turned off the lamp and listened, heart racing. There was again a tap, then another, then a third. I slowly pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The trees were still, and the moonlight bathed the cabin in an eerie glow. I exhaled sharply, chastising myself for being paranoid. But as I lay back down, the tapping resumed, only now it was coming from the door. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated. I didn't want to seem foolish, but the noise wouldn't stop. Each tap felt like it was getting closer, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing just outside the door. I stood frozen in place, the flashlight trembling in my hand. After what seemed like forever, I slowly approached the door, heart pounding in my chest. I was about to reach for the handle when something pushed against it from the outside. It wasn't a knock anymore. Someone or something was trying to get in. Panic surged through me as I pulled away from the door and backed into a corner of the room. The cabin was silent once again, except for my rapid breathing. My mind raced, wondering if I had made a mistake by coming here alone. Maybe it was just some curious animal or a prankster, but I couldn't dismiss the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air felt colder now, and I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to calm down. I could hear the wind howling outside, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being hunted. I spent the rest of the night awake, listening for any sound, but the tapping never came again. By morning, I felt exhausted and unsettled, but I convinced myself it was nothing more than a trick of the mind, too much silence, too much isolation. I packed my things and headed out into the woods to explore, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. But as I walked deeper into the forest, something caught my eye. Half hidden in the underbrush, just beyond the trees, was an old wooden structure. A shack, barely visible behind the thick foliage. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, just like the cabin. Compelled by curiosity, I approached cautiously. The door was wide open and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the wooden floor creaked beneath my feet. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. There were old pictures on the walls, faded photographs of a family, but their faces were scratched out, their eyes marked with dark ink. I felt my stomach twist as I examined the photographs more closely. There was something unsettling about them. The people in the pictures seemed familiar, but I couldn't place why. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw something that made my heart stop. A figure standing in the shadows, watching me. It was a man, though his features were hard to make out in the dim light. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see his hands, pale, long, and thin. He didn't move, just stared at me as I stood frozen in place. I backed up, my flashlight shaking as I turned to leave. But as I reached the door, I heard a voice, low and breathless. "You shouldn't have come here." I bolted out of the shack, running as fast as I could. I didn't look back, but I could feel something following me, a presence just at the edge of my vision. My pulse thundered in my ears as I reached the clearing where my car was parked. I didn't even stop to pack up. I threw my things into the back seat, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I still don't know who or what was in that shack, or how they had followed me to the cabin. But as I drove away from the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that whatever I had encountered had been waiting for someone like me to find it. I was driving alone down a long, deserted highway late one evening. The sky had turned dark and the wind was picking up, making the car sway slightly. There was nothing but endless road and a few scattered trees on either side. It had been hours since I had passed the last town, and I was beginning to wonder if I would ever see another soul. The loneliness of the road was starting to feel oppressive. The headlights illuminated nothing but a long stretch of asphalt and the occasional flicker of a distant sign. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since lunch, but I wasn't about to stop in the middle of nowhere. Not at this hour. As I approached a bend in the road, something strange caught my eye. Up ahead, there was a faint figure on the shoulder, barely visible in the shadows. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the headlights, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man standing there, facing away from me. He wasn't moving, just standing perfectly still, staring into the dark. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. Something about the way he stood, rigid and unblinking, unnerved me. My mind raced. Was he lost? Had he broken down? Why wasn't he moving? I hesitated for a moment, then, against my better judgment, I pulled over. The man didn't acknowledge me as I stepped out of the car. He simply stood there, his back still turned, his posture unnervingly still. "Hey," I called out, but there was no response. My voice echoed in the silence. I took a cautious step toward him, my feet crunching against the gravel. I called out again. "Are you okay?" That was when he finally moved. Slowly, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings, he turned his head towards me. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were wide, too wide, like they hadn't blinked in days. His mouth stretched into a thin smile, devoid of warmth. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill straight to your bones. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and hollow, as if it came from somewhere deep underground. A shiver ran down my spine. "What?" I stammered, stepping back. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated, his voice now trembling with an unspoken urgency. He started to take a step toward me, slowly, as if he were trying to close the distance between us in a controlled, deliberate way. I quickly turned and ran back to the car, fumbling with the door handle. My hands shook as I managed to open it and slide inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The man had not moved, but his eyes were locked onto mine, and that smile, it stayed. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in short gasps. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I had to get out of there. I started the car and slammed the gas pedal, sending the tires screeching as I sped away. My hands were still trembling on the wheel and my mind raced. Why had he been standing there? What did he mean by "you shouldn't be here"? As I drove faster, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw him standing in the middle of the road, watching me as I sped away. But when I blinked, he was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the next town. It was hours before I felt my hands stop shaking, but even then, the feeling of being watched never quite left me. I tried to tell myself it was just some random person, maybe even a hitchhiker who had wandered too far, but deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The next day, I looked up the stretch of highway I had been on. To my surprise, I found an old news article about that very road. The article detailed several strange disappearances that had occurred over the years, all of them along that same highway. And one name stood out: a man who had gone missing years ago, last seen standing by the side of the road. His name? It was the same as the man I had seen. I haven't driven that road since. And every time I see someone standing alone on the side of the highway, I can't help but wonder if they too are lost in time, waiting for someone else to make the same mistake I did. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for weeks, just a few days alone in the mountains to clear my head. I found the perfect place on Airbnb, a secluded cabin with a breathtaking view, surrounded by thick woods. The description promised peace, quiet, and the perfect escape from the noise of the city. I didn't think twice about booking it. When I arrived, the sun was already starting to set, casting an eerie orange glow over the forest. The cabin was more remote than I had anticipated. It sat at the end of a long, narrow road, barely visible behind a dense line of trees. The place looked beautiful from the outside, but there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite place. Still, I shrugged it off and made my way inside. The cabin had an old, rustic charm to it. The wooden floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored the rooms. The living area had a large stone fireplace, a cozy couch, and a couple of chairs. It seemed like the ideal spot to unwind. I unpacked my bags and decided to settle in for the evening. As I was finishing my dinner, I heard a noise, faint but distinct, a soft scraping sound coming from upstairs. I paused, trying to figure out what it could be. The house was old, maybe the pipes, or perhaps the wind. But then I heard it again, louder this time: scrape, scrape, scrape. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but the noise was relentless. Curiosity and unease gnawed at me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the house seemed to groan in protest. The sound was coming from the room at the end of the hall, a door that was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment. Something about this didn't sit right with me. I had rented the place through Airbnb, but I had never met the owner. What if someone had snuck in? I slowly pushed the door open, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The room was empty. I looked around, confused. The only thing unusual was a small, weathered chair in the center of the room. It was positioned perfectly in front of the window, as though someone had been sitting there, watching the woods. The scraping sound had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something off about the chair, the way it seemed to be waiting, as if expecting someone to return. I stepped closer to examine it. As I did, I noticed a faint mark on the floor beneath the chair, a pattern etched into the wood, almost like it had been dragged there repeatedly. I leaned in, shining the light over the mark, and that's when I saw it. A small photograph wedged between the floorboards, partially hidden by the chair. I reached down and pulled it out, my fingers trembling. It was an old black and white photo of the cabin, taken from an angle I hadn't seen before. The image showed the front porch, but there was someone standing there. A man, his face obscured by shadows just barely visible in the dim light. I shuddered, but something compelled me to turn the photo over. There, written in faded ink, were the words, "I will be watching. You can never leave." My blood ran cold. Who had left this here? And why was it hidden under the chair? Suddenly, I heard a noise downstairs. The front door creaked open, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Who could it be? The owner? Or someone else? I wasn't supposed to meet anyone here. I slowly backed out of the room and made my way back to the stairs. The footsteps grew louder, closer now. I could hear someone breathing heavily as if they were right behind me. Panic surged through me, but I had to remain calm. I had to get out. I grabbed my bags in a rush, my hands shaking. But just as I reached the door, I glanced over my shoulder. The chair upstairs was rocking slowly back and forth. The scraping sound had started again, this time coming from upstairs. I slammed the door behind me and rushed to my car, barely able to see straight through my panic. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. My heart was still racing, my mind reeling from what had happened. Later, I tried to contact the Airbnb owner. The listing had been taken down and I couldn't find any information on the property. The number I had called was no longer in service. I could find no trace of the place, no history of the cabin in any town records. I don't know what happened in that cabin, but I never went back. And now, when I think about it, I can still hear the sound of that chair scraping across the floor as if someone, somewhere, has been waiting for me to return. I had always enjoyed camping. There was something about being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature, that felt refreshing. So when I found a secluded campground deep in the woods, far from the usual crowded parks, I thought it would be the perfect place to unwind. I didn't think twice about it when I reserved a spot. The sun had just set as I drove down the long, winding road, my headlights cutting through the darkening trees. I had arrived later than I planned, but there was still enough light to get set up. The campground was nearly empty. There were a few tents pitched in the distance, but it felt unusually quiet, almost as if the place had been abandoned. I set up my tent quickly, trying to ignore the unsettling stillness around me. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the rustle of the wind through the trees. I tried to shake the odd feeling that had started to settle in my stomach. Once I had the fire going, I sat by the campfire, trying to enjoy the solitude. The flames flickered, casting strange shadows on the ground. I tried to relax, but something about the woods felt off. The quiet was too thick, too heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I stood up, stretched, and began to walk toward the small creek near my campsite. The water was dark and slow-moving, reflecting the dim light of the stars above. As I knelt to wash my hands, I heard something behind me, a twig snapping, followed by the sound of footsteps on the dirt. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought it was another camper, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I glanced around, but the shadows between the trees were too deep to see clearly. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just an animal. But then I heard it again, closer this time. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward me through the woods. I quickly stood up and turned, scanning the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness of the forest. No response. The footsteps stopped, but the air felt heavier, charged with tension. I hesitated, my heart pounding. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure moving between the trees. A silhouette, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel its gaze on me, sharp and predatory. My legs moved before I could think, running back toward my tent, my heart hammering in my chest. As I scrambled to grab my things, I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it clearly. The figure had stopped at the edge of the campsite, standing perfectly still. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront it? Should I call for help? But I was so far from any sort of civilization. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. Without thinking, I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the figure. For a moment, the beam of light illuminated the trees around it, but the figure wasn't there anymore. The spot where I had seen it was empty, as though it had never been there at all. I stood frozen, my breath visible in the cold air, unsure of what had just happened. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I knew I couldn't walk through the woods alone at night. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again, only this time they were behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The forest had gone completely silent. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things and ran. My heart was pounding in my ears as I dashed through the campsite, barely stopping to look at the path ahead. The cold night air cut at my face as I stumbled, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I didn't stop running until I reached the car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to start the engine. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing behind me. But there was nothing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened at the campground. No one would believe me anyway. And when I looked up the campsite online the next day, I found that it was listed as permanently closed. There were no reviews, no photos, nothing. The last time I checked, the campground had disappeared from all maps, as though it had never existed at all. Now, when I think back on it, I wonder if I was the only one who had been there. Or if there's something waiting out there in the woods, watching, always watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to wander into its grasp. I had never been one to believe in superstitions or spooky stories, but that night changed everything. I was traveling for work, a long drive on a quiet, desolate highway. The road stretched on for miles, flanked by dark trees and empty fields. I had planned to reach the next town by nightfall, but a sudden storm rolled in, and the visibility dropped to nearly nothing. The rain came in sheets, pounding against the windshield. It was impossible to see anything clearly, and I had to pull over to the side of the road. I found a small, overgrown bus stop nearby. There was no sign of life, but at least it offered a bit of shelter from the storm. The metal bench was covered in rust, and the roof looked like it had been there for decades. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the wet pavement. I figured I'd wait there for a while, hoping the storm would let up. I turned off the car and sat in silence, staring out into the rain. It was a peaceful moment at first, but that didn't last long. I kept hearing faint noises, soft thuds like someone tapping on the roof. At first, I thought it was just the storm, but as the minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy. I looked around, but the bus stop was empty. I checked the rearview mirror, scanning the darkness behind me, but there was no one in sight. The sound kept coming, getting louder, like footsteps moving around my car. Then there was a soft knock on the driver's side window. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't dare look, but I could feel something. Someone was standing there. I was alone. I had made sure there was no one else around when I parked, so who could it be? My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I felt a cold sweat creeping down my back, but I had to check. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and I couldn't believe what I saw. A figure, barely visible in the rain, was standing right outside my window. The person wore a long coat, the hood pulled low over their face, and they didn't move. They just stood there staring. No words, no sound, just stillness. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I had no idea what to do. Should I open the window and speak to them? Should I drive away? Before I could make up my mind, the figure suddenly lifted their hand and gestured toward the bus stop, pointing toward the empty bench. I stared at their gloved hand, unsure of what they meant. The person didn't speak, but the silent command was clear. They wanted me to get out of the car. I quickly turned the ignition back on, but as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure hadn't moved from the window. Instead, there was now a second person standing right next to them, also in a long coat, hooded, and with the same lifeless, eerie stillness. The two of them stood together, unmoving, just staring at me. Panic surged through me. I didn't care anymore about the storm or the dark road ahead. I needed to leave, to get out of there now. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away from the bus stop, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. I drove through the storm for hours, my hands clenched tightly on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Eventually the rain let up, but I didn't stop. I didn't feel safe until I reached the town. The next morning I was still rattled. I couldn't get the image of those two figures out of my head, and I needed answers. I called the local authorities, asking if there had been any reports of strange activity near the old bus stop. The response I got chilled me to the bone. The bus stop had been abandoned for over 20 years. No buses had passed by that road in at least a decade, and no one had lived in the area for even longer. I never figured out who those figures were or what they wanted. But every time I pass that stretch of highway, I can't help but wonder if they're still standing there, waiting for someone else to drive by, to make them move again. I wasn't expecting much when I booked the cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway, just me in the woods. A place to unplug, clear my head. My friends had warned me, of course. They all said it seemed too isolated, too off the beaten path, but I didn't mind. I needed solitude, and the price was right. The cabin was small and old, tucked away deep in a forest. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. As I unpacked, I noticed how quiet it was, unnaturally so. No neighbors, no traffic, not even the usual hum of nearby towns. Just endless trees. Inside, the cabin was cozy enough. A stone fireplace, a few old chairs, and a large wooden table in the center. But there was one thing that immediately caught my attention. A full-length mirror standing in the corner beside the far wall. It wasn't like any mirror I'd ever seen before. The frame was thick, dark wood and covered in intricate carvings that looked old, too old, like they had been worn down over centuries. The glass itself was warped, distorting the image in subtle, unsettling ways. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I stood in front of it, studying my reflection. There was something wrong about it, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation messing with my head. That night, I tried to relax by the fire, but something about the cabin didn't sit right. The shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, flickering like they had a life of their own. The wind outside began to pick up, rattling the windows and causing the trees to sway violently. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired. But as the night dragged on, I kept hearing faint noises coming from the back of the cabin, scratching sounds as if something was dragging along the wooden floor. I got up, heart pounding, and tiptoed toward the back room where the mirror stood. As I passed it, I glanced into the glass. My reflection was just a little too slow to match my movements, a fraction of a second behind. I froze. I turned back toward the mirror, and for just a split second, I could have sworn I saw something moving behind me. A figure, faint and shadowy, standing in the doorway. But when I turned around, there was nothing there. The room was empty. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breath steady. I was imagining things. There was no one in the cabin except me. I was alone. But then I heard it again, a soft, scraping sound. Closer this time. I turned back toward the mirror. My reflection was still standing there, but now something was different. The figure in the mirror wasn't me. It was someone else. A woman with long, dark hair, standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on mine. She wore a long, faded dress, and her face was pale, unnaturally so, as if she had been trapped inside the mirror for years. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection didn't move. She just stood there staring. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in a silent stare with the woman in the mirror, but when I finally snapped out of it, I ran. I didn't care about the storm, the rain, or the dark woods outside. I grabbed my bag and ran out of the cabin, sprinting toward the car. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The following week, I tried to find out more about the cabin and its history. I asked around, spoke to locals, but no one knew anything about it. There were rumors about an old woman who had once lived there alone, but no one could remember when. The cabin had always been there, standing empty, no one daring to stay inside. I never returned. But sometimes, when I look in a mirror, I feel a strange chill run down my spine, as if something is watching me from just beyond the glass. And I wonder if the woman in the cabin is still there, waiting for someone else to wander into her reflection. I've always enjoyed camping alone. There's something peaceful about being out in nature, away from the noise of the world, just you and the wilderness. I had planned a weekend trip in the mountains, a spot I had visited many times before, but this time was different. The sun had just set, and I was setting up my tent at my usual spot, a secluded area by a small lake surrounded by tall trees. The wind was calm, the temperature perfect, and everything felt like it was going according to plan. I built a small fire, its crackling sound blending with the occasional call of a distant bird. I felt content, alone but not lonely. As I sat by the fire, I noticed something odd, a faint light in the distance moving through the trees. At first, I assumed it was just a hiker or another camper, but the light was moving in an erratic pattern, almost as if it was being carried by someone who couldn't see where they were going. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just someone else enjoying the woods at night. But the light didn't go away. It moved closer, the strange bobbing motion drawing my attention again. I stood up and squinted, trying to see through the darkness. Then I saw him. A man dressed in dark clothing was walking toward my campsite, holding a lantern. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, and he walked slowly, deliberately, with a strange, unsettling rhythm. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, unsure whether to be friendly or cautious. The man didn't answer. He just kept walking, his pace never increasing, never slowing. It was as if he had no intention of stopping. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. He was too close now to ignore, but too far to make out any details about him. Something about him seemed off, like he wasn't entirely real. He reached the edge of my camp and stopped, standing just outside the light of my fire. I could see his figure more clearly now, but his face remained in shadow. "Can I help you?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice steady. For a long time he didn't say a word. I waited, the silence between us growing thick and uncomfortable. Then finally he raised his lantern and gestured to my campfire. "Are you alone?" he asked, his voice a low whisper that carried easily through the still night air. I nodded, though I felt an unsettling unease in my chest. There was something wrong with his presence. He didn't belong here, not in this peaceful spot in the woods. "Good," he said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I think it's better if you are." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and began walking away, disappearing into the darkness, his lantern light flickering as he moved deeper into the woods. I stood there, frozen, watching him go. The fire crackled, the wind rustled through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I should have packed up and left right then, but the night felt too heavy, too still. The man hadn't seemed overtly dangerous, but his words, his presence lingered in my mind. I decided to stay the night. After all, it was my campsite and there was nothing to fear, right? But sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing strange noises outside my tent, twigs snapping, footsteps in the leaves, but every time I peeked out there was nothing there. The wind? A wild animal? I tried to ignore it, to convince myself I was just being paranoid. Morning came, and with it, a strange calmness. I packed up my things and left the campsite, eager to move on and put the weird encounter behind me. But as I walked back down the trail, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Lying in the middle of the path was the lantern the man had been holding. I bent down to inspect it. It was covered in dirt, the glass cracked, but otherwise, it seemed like it had been used recently. There was no way the man could have left it behind. He'd been holding it when he walked away. Suddenly, a cold shiver ran through me. I had never seen that man again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how alone I had really been out there, alone with a stranger in the dark. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me from somewhere, waiting for me to turn around. I haven't been camping alone since. It was a quiet Wednesday night when I first noticed something was wrong. I had just moved into a small apartment on the edge of town, a cozy place I'd found online, perfect for someone like me who preferred solitude. The apartment was modest, with thick curtains that kept the world outside and a small kitchen where I could enjoy my meals in peace. The night had settled in and I was curled up on the couch watching TV when the phone rang. The apartment had a landline which I didn't expect to get much use out of. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the green button. I usually didn't answer numbers I didn't recognize, but something made me curious. "Hello?" I said, voice soft and unsure. There was no answer at first, just static on the line. I almost hung up, thinking it was a prank, but then a voice came through. It was low, a deep whisper that felt like it came from just behind my ear. "You shouldn't have moved here." I froze. My heart skipped a beat as my mind raced. Who was this? How did they know I had just moved in? I didn't even recognize the voice, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It was calm, but there was an edge to it, like a warning wrapped in a riddle. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to steady my breath. My eyes darted around the dark apartment, my skin prickling with unease. The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, like fingernails tapping against glass. It seemed to be coming from outside my window. I quickly stood up, feeling my pulse quicken. There was no one there. The night outside was quiet. "Hello?" I repeated, the words barely leaving my lips. "Who are you?" The tapping stopped. The silence in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. Then the voice returned, colder this time. "Look out the window." I froze, my feet planted to the floor. There was no way I was going near the window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was no prank. This was something else. But my body moved of its own accord, pulling me toward the window against my better judgment. I parted the curtains slowly, peeking out into the darkness. For a long moment I saw nothing. The street was empty, the trees still. But then I saw it. Someone standing on the far side of the street, just barely illuminated by the dim streetlight. A figure, tall with broad shoulders, a hood obscuring their face. They weren't moving. They were just standing there. I couldn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the figure, my hand still holding the curtain open, trembling slightly. My mind raced. Had they been watching me? Why were they just standing there? "Who are you?" I whispered to the night, but of course there was no answer. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was watching them. Then the phone rang again. I quickly pulled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't even wait to see the number. I answered the call immediately, my voice shaking. "Who is this? What do you want?" The voice on the other end was quieter now, almost serene. "You're not alone," it whispered. "Never alone." Before I could respond, the call ended. I stood there in the dead silence of my apartment, the phone still pressed to my ear. The line was dead. I hung up and dropped the phone onto the couch, my hands shaking. I turned back to the window, but the figure was gone. I couldn't see them anywhere on the street. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I stayed awake, clutching a baseball bat that I had found in a closet, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, with the unsettling thought that someone had been watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I left the apartment early, deciding that I needed to clear my head. But when I came back later that afternoon, I noticed something odd. On my doorstep, there was a small envelope. No address, no name, just a blank piece of paper inside. I unfolded it slowly, the message written in neat, block letters. "You are being watched." I ran my fingers over the paper, a chill crawling up my spine. I never heard from the voice again, but every night since, I've kept the curtains closed and I make sure my windows are locked. I don't know who called that night, or who was standing across the street. But I do know one thing, someone is still watching, and I'm not sure if they ever left. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally finished my shift at the office. My name's Sarah, and I work in marketing for a tech company downtown. The long hours had become routine, but tonight the fatigue felt different, heavier somehow. As I stepped out of the building, the city was quiet, almost eerie. The streets were deserted, save for the dim streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I had a half-hour drive home, and the route took me through the outskirts of the city. A few poorly lit roads, some deserted stretches of highway, and then the winding path through the woods that led to my house. I often liked the solitude of the drive, especially after a long day. But tonight something felt off. I didn't think much of it at first, but about 15 minutes into my drive, I noticed a black sedan tailing me. At first, I chalked it up to coincidence. Maybe they were going the same way, but as I made a left turn onto a narrower road, the car did the same. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I didn't recognize the car, and it was too close. I decided to test my theory. I sped up, hoping to shake the car. It followed suit. I slowed down to see if the car would pass, but it matched my speed. I turned on the high beams, but the sedan's headlights stayed fixed behind me, glaring in my rearview mirror. Panic began to rise in my chest, but I tried to keep my cool. I couldn't be sure if I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some coincidence. I needed to get to a well-lit area, somewhere I could see what was going on and possibly get help. The road ahead curved into a quiet, isolated gas station that was always open, even at this hour. It would be my best shot. As I pulled into the gas station, I could see the sedan in my rearview mirror, slowing down and turning with me. I didn't even give it a second thought. I slammed the car into park, yanked the keys from the ignition, and threw open the door. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I ran toward the gas station's small convenience store. But before I could reach the door, I heard it. The screech of tires and a door slamming shut. I froze. Slowly I turned to look. A tall figure, cloaked in a black hoodie, was walking toward me with a steady, unnerving pace. I felt my heart skip a beat. I could see nothing of his face except for the faint outline of it under the hood. I bolted toward the door of the convenience store, but the man was faster than I anticipated. Just as I grabbed the handle, I felt a cold hand grab my shoulder. My blood ran cold and a scream caught in my throat. "Hey, let go of me," I shouted, trying to wriggle out of his grasp. But his grip tightened. "Just give me your purse," the man muttered, his voice low and threatening. My stomach dropped. I knew I had to do something, anything. I kicked out, aiming for his knee. He staggered back, but only for a second. That was enough. I ripped the door open, stumbling inside the store and slamming it behind me. The man pounded on the door once before stopping, his muffled curses growing distant. "Are you all right?" the gas station attendant asked, coming around from the counter. He looked concerned, but there was something about his gaze that made me uneasy. He didn't seem as surprised by the situation as he should have been. I nodded quickly, breathing heavily. I think so. I don't know what happened. I was just driving home and..." Before I could finish, the door rattled. The man was outside again. I peeked through the window. The black sedan was still parked, now just beyond the pumps. The driver hadn't moved. Neither had the man who'd chased me. And then, just like that, the car and the man were gone. The attendant, a middle-aged man with dark circles under his eyes, assured me that the police would be on their way soon. But when the police arrived and I gave my statement, there was no sign of the black sedan and no trace of the man. The gas station attendant claimed he'd never seen anyone suspicious in the area before. I asked to review the security footage, but the attendant told me the cameras had mysteriously failed that night. I left the station shaken, but thankful I had gotten away. I kept looking over my shoulder on my drive home, convinced that the black sedan might still be following me. But it wasn't. That was the last I saw of the man, or so I thought. The next morning, I received an anonymous package. Inside was a piece of paper with a note: "You're lucky this time. Next time you won't be." The handwriting looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. I've since moved to a different part of town, but I still can't shake the feeling that the man is still out there watching. And every time I drive home late, I make sure I'm never alone. I had always craved solitude. That's why I booked a weekend getaway in a remote cabin in the mountains, far from the city lights and the constant hum of daily life. The drive up was scenic, the roads winding through snow-covered trees and past frozen lakes. But by the time I arrived, a blizzard had rolled in and visibility was nearly zero. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled on a quiet hill with no neighbors in sight. It was just what I needed: peace and isolation. As night fell, the howling winds outside rattled the wooden walls of the cabin. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I wrapped myself in a blanket with a book, content in my silence. But then I heard it, soft but distinct, a faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow. I paused, the hairs on my neck standing up. It was strange. The cabin was miles from the nearest road, and no one was supposed to be around. I chalked it up to the wind playing tricks on me and returned to my book. But then I heard it again. This time closer. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, was unmistakable. I stood up and peered out the window, but the snowstorm was so intense I could barely see more than a few feet. My heart raced. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone in need of help. Maybe I should go outside and check. But something in my gut told me not to. The footsteps continued, echoing through the snow. They came closer. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself. The door was locked. The windows were shut tight. I tried to calm my breathing, reminding myself that it could be anyone. Someone who had gotten lost in the storm, needing shelter. But my instincts screamed otherwise. There was something wrong. I sat back down, gripping my phone tightly, willing for a signal to appear. But as the minutes ticked by, the footsteps grew louder. They circled the cabin. Someone, or something, was walking around the outside, coming from different directions as if they were deliberately trying to confuse me. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was out there knew I was inside, knew I was watching, waiting. Suddenly the sound stopped. I held my breath. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind whistling through the trees. Then a soft knock echoed from the door. Just one knock, but it was loud enough to send a shock of fear through me. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. Should I answer it? Was it a person lost and desperate? Or was it someone, something, playing with me? I remained still, staring at the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. But the knock didn't sound like it came from a human hand. It was heavier, like something larger was pounding at the door. The hairs on my neck stood up. I couldn't breathe. I slowly crept to the door, my hand hovering near the lock, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't just lost. They were waiting, watching. I slowly backed away from the door, moving quietly toward the back of the cabin. I checked the windows again, praying I would see the storm clear up so I could escape, but the snow continued to fall, thick and heavy. As I turned back around, my breath caught in my throat. Through the frosted window I saw it. A figure. A shadow standing just outside the door. I froze. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, like it was staring directly at me. My heart raced as I quickly turned off the lights, plunging the cabin into darkness. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. I was trapped. The figure remained there for what felt like hours, unmoving, silent. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The footsteps in the snow faded, the eerie silence returning to the cabin. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind racing. Who was that? Why were they out there? And why had they left? As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That someone, or something, had been watching me the entire time. The blizzard raged outside, isolating me from the world. I tried to sleep, but the unease gnawed at me, keeping me awake. I kept thinking I could hear the footsteps again, faint and distant, but when I checked, the snow outside was undisturbed. By morning, the storm had cleared. The snow was still deep, but the sun was shining. I carefully stepped outside, my breath clouding in the cold air, and looked around. There were no footprints around the cabin, nothing to indicate anyone had been there. But the feeling of being watched never left me. And as I packed my things to leave, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin. The door slightly ajar as if someone had been waiting for me to leave. The snow was untouched. But the mystery of that night lingered in my mind, a chilling reminder that sometimes the most frightening thing isn't what you see, it's what you don't. I thought it was just a matter of time before I got used to the isolation. After all, I had moved into this remote cabin on the edge of the woods for peace and quiet, away from the noise of the city and the constant stress of my everyday life. It wasn't luxurious, just a small wooden structure with a creaky porch and a fireplace that hardly ever worked. But it was mine, and for the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without the interference of traffic, people, or endless buzzing of modern life. It was the perfect escape, or so I thought. The first couple of weeks passed without incident. The isolation became more comforting than unnerving. I spent most of my days hiking through the thick forest, exploring the area around the cabin, getting acquainted with the sounds of the wilderness. At night, I'd curl up with a book or just stare out the window at the expanse of trees, which, though dark and intimidating, felt oddly protective. But then, about 3 weeks in, I started hearing things. It wasn't loud at first, just faint creaks and groans coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was just the natural sounds of the woods settling. The trees, the wind, the animals. But it wasn't long before the sounds became more frequent, and they weren't just creaks anymore. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, and close. They sounded as if they were right outside my door. At first, I told myself it was a deer, maybe even a bear wandering around, but the more I heard them, the more unsettling it became. It was too deliberate, too purposeful. I remember the first night I actually went outside to investigate. It was late, and the moon was hidden behind a blanket of clouds. I had heard the footsteps again, and I had had enough. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch, my heart pounding in my chest. The woods were eerily still. No wind, no animals, just silence. I swept the light back and forth, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No sign of life. Just trees, their twisted branches like fingers reaching for the sky. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as I turned to head back inside. That's when I saw it, a footprint. It was barely visible in the dirt near the steps to the porch. Large, barefoot. The outline was clear enough that it sent a chill through my entire body. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to reason with myself. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a trick of the light. But no, that wasn't right. Looked human. I quickly retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up, and my mind raced through all the possibilities. Perhaps a neighbor, though I hadn't seen a soul for miles. Or maybe it was a hunter, though the area was too remote for that. But then I realized I hadn't heard a car, a sound, anything at all that would have indicated another person's presence. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the dark, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. The footsteps continued for days after that. Sometimes they were right outside the cabin, sometimes further away, but they never stopped. Then about a week later, I found something that turned my unease into full-blown terror. I was out in the woods again, trying to clear my mind. The sun was setting and the sky was painted in hues of orange and purple. I was walking along a trail I hadn't noticed before when I saw it, an old weather-beaten shack hidden behind a thicket of trees. I froze. I had walked this area countless times and never once seen that building. I hesitated for a moment, my gut telling me to turn back. But curiosity got the better of me. I approached it cautiously, the air thick with the scent of rotting wood and damp earth. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. The interior was dark and stale, with dust thick on the floor. There was nothing of interest, no furniture, no personal items, just piles of rotting debris. But then I saw something in the corner. A pile of old yellowed newspapers. I bent down to examine them, brushing off the dust, and the first headline that caught my eye was enough to make my heart stop. Local man found dead in woods. Authorities baffled by cause of death. I scanned the page, my hands trembling. It was an article from years ago, about a man who had gone missing in these very woods. His body was found just outside the cabin I had rented, and the cause of death was never determined. But there was more. I flipped through the rest of the newspapers, and each one seemed to tell the same story: more deaths, more disappearances, all of them within a few miles of this cabin. And every single one had something in common. They all had been found barefoot. I felt the blood drain from my face. My stomach turned. I needed to get out of there. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but before I could take a step, I heard something behind me, a soft shuffling sound as if someone was dragging their feet through the dirt. I froze. It was the same sound, the footsteps. I whirled around, but there was no one there. Just the empty, suffocating air. I bolted back to the cabin, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my ears. I locked every door and window, bolted the shutters, and grabbed the phone, only to realize there was no signal. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak, every groan of the cabin made my pulse spike. But the worst part? The thing that still haunts me to this day? The sound of someone, or something, standing just outside my window, breathing. I never stayed another night in that cabin. I packed my things, ran to my car, and didn't look back. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me. And I know I'll never be able to escape it, because it's always out there waiting, in the woods, in the silence, just beyond the light. And I can't stop hearing the footsteps. It started with the smallest things. Unexplainable noises in the dead of night, scratching, tapping, faint footsteps. At first, I brushed it off, convinced the house was simply settling, or maybe it was the wind. But as the days passed, the noises grew more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. At night, when I was lying in bed, they would start, soft, measured steps moving down the hallway outside my room. I'd freeze, barely able to breathe, straining to hear. Was it the wind or something else? My heart raced as I slowly got up, checked the hallway, and found nothing. It became a nightly ritual. I would lie awake, listening to the soft creaks of the house, the ticking of the clock, the shuffling sounds that never seemed to stop. It wasn't long before I started checking the locks on my doors before bed. They were always secure. But somehow the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I'm a rational person. I convinced myself that it was just nerves. Maybe the house was old and the noises were just part of its creaky charm. But the footsteps weren't the only thing that began to unsettle me. It was the way the house felt, like it had a pulse of its own. As if something, or someone, was moving through it when I wasn't around. One night it all changed. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not just any breathing, but slow, deliberate, too close. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to stay still, my eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, hoping it was just a dream. But the breathing continued right beside my bed. I could feel the air shift as if someone was standing next to me, watching me. A cold sweat broke out on my skin and I barely dared to move. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. I wanted to call the police but couldn't bring myself to make a sound. My eyes darted to the door. The breathing was still there, steady and patient, but I couldn't see anyone. I decided to act. Slowly, I reached over and grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand. I shined it around the room. Nothing. The air was thick with tension, but there was no one. No one in the room, no one standing over me. I jumped out of bed, shining the light under the bed, inside the closet, checking every corner of the room. There was no one. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. Even though I had checked the entire room, the feeling of being watched never left. The oppressive silence returned, heavier than before, and I knew something was in the house. The next morning, I checked the security cameras. I had installed them a few days before, after the noises started getting worse. I figured if I could capture something on tape, I could finally prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. As I sat in front of the monitor, I saw nothing. The footage showed an empty house. No sign of anyone entering. No strange movements. Just me going about my evening routine, locking up and heading to bed. But then something caught my attention. In one of the recordings, I saw the lights flicker, just for a moment, but it was there. And in another clip, there was a strange distortion in the hallway, a brief shift in the shadows that couldn't have been a trick of the light. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. I watched the footage again, and again. Each time I saw it, the distortion grew clearer. Someone was moving in the hallway, but it never fully appeared on the camera. It was as if whoever, or whatever, was there didn't want to be seen. But I could feel it. Something was there. My heart sank as I watched the footage from the night before. I hadn't imagined it. I wasn't losing my mind. That night, I decided to stay awake, armed with the knowledge that something was hiding in my house. I locked every door and window. I even barricaded myself in my room, hoping that whatever it was would just leave me alone. But the footsteps started again. This time they weren't faint. They were loud, deliberate, like someone pacing just outside my door. My blood ran cold as I pressed my back against the wall, listening. My mind raced with fear. What if it was a burglar? What if someone had broken in? I grabbed my phone again and dialed 911. But just as I was about to speak, the footsteps stopped. I waited, breathless, for what felt like an eternity. Then came the sound of a door opening, softly, slowly. My bedroom door creaked as it inched open. My heart dropped to my stomach. I wasn't imagining this. There was someone in my house. The door opened wider, but there was nothing. No one in the doorway. Just the deep darkness. I had to make a choice. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave. I grabbed my things and ran to the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I checked the lock. It was secured as it had been the whole time. My hands shook violently as I fumbled with the keys, but when I looked up, there in the corner of the room was the faint outline of a person. I didn't look back. I ran out of the house, the front door swinging open behind me. My feet hit the pavement as I bolted down the street, my mind spinning with terror. I thought I was safe, but when I checked my phone the next morning, I saw a missed call, an unknown number. I didn't recognize the area code. I stared at the screen, a chill running down my spine. I listened to the voicemail. Leave? It was barely a whisper, but the voice on the other end was clear. It was too familiar. I recognized it immediately. It was my own voice, somehow distorted as if it had been recorded while I slept. I never went back to that house. The police investigated, but they found nothing. There were no signs of a break-in. No trace of anyone ever being there. But weeks later they told me something disturbing. Someone had been living in my attic, hidden away in the shadows, watching me every night. The police found evidence that the man had been in my house for months. And worse still, he had never been caught, even though he had moved freely through the house while I slept. I don't know how he got in or why he chose me. But the scariest part? The intruder was still out there watching. And now I know I'm never truly alone. I'd always thought I had an affinity for the night. No distractions, no people. Just the quiet hum of the world as it slept. So when I took a night shift job as a security guard at the old factory on the outskirts of town, I thought it would be easy money. The factory had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its machinery rusting in silence. It was the perfect job for someone like me, someone who didn't mind the loneliness. At first, the job was uneventful. I'd sit in the tiny security office, a thick metal door separating me from the empty factory floor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, and outside the wind howled through the trees, but I didn't mind. The sound of the wind was soothing. I'd spend most of my time scrolling through my phone, checking the security cameras every few minutes. It was a cold, stormy night when things started to get strange. The rain hammered against the windows and the wind rattled the walls. At about 2 a.m., I noticed something odd on the monitors, a figure moving across the factory floor. I frowned. The place was locked down tight. There was no way anyone could be inside. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. The factory floor was vast, with rows of old, decaying machines and piles of scrap metal. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I walked through the aisles. My flashlight beam danced across the shadows, revealing nothing unusual. I checked the doors again, locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, I thought. After all, I hadn't slept much the night before, and the storm outside was unnerving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I returned to the security office, trying to shake off the unease. But when I sat back down and checked the monitors again, the figure was there. It wasn't moving anymore. It was just standing in the same spot, facing the camera. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadows, but there was something unsettling about it. Something about the stillness of it made my stomach turn. I grabbed my walkie-talkie and called the main office. No response. I tried again and again, nothing. My heart started to race. This was strange. I was completely alone. Maybe the storm had knocked out the radio towers, I thought. But I didn't believe it. Something was wrong. I picked up the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The storm outside intensified, and I felt a chill creeping down my spine. The air in the office seemed to grow thicker. I decided to check the factory floor again, just to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. As I walked through the aisles again, I felt the distinct sensation of someone, or something, following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I turned around sharply. But there was nothing. The factory floor was as empty as ever. That's when I noticed it. A faint scraping sound coming from one of the old machines in the far corner. It was a low, metallic sound like something was dragging across the floor. I shone my flashlight in that direction and froze. A large industrial machine, one that hadn't been used in years, was slowly moving. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but enough to send a jolt of panic through my chest. I ran to the machine, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached it, the movement stopped. It was as if nothing had happened. My breath came in short gasps as I inspected the machine, but there was nothing unusual. It hadn't moved an inch. I turned around, scanning the factory floor again. And that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the shadows, right behind me. A tall, dark silhouette, its face obscured by the darkness. I couldn't move. My entire body froze. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. And then, in a voice so faint it was almost a whisper, I heard it say, "You shouldn't be here." I whipped around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was gone. I sprinted back to the security office, slamming the door shut behind me. I checked the cameras again. The factory floor was empty, but I knew what I had seen. I had seen someone, or something. My hands were shaking as I tried the phone again. This time it worked. I quickly dialed 911, but when the operator picked up, she sounded confused. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone in the factory. I need help. I think they're inside, but the doors are locked. I don't know how they got in. Sir, this is the second time we've gotten a call about that factory tonight. We've already sent someone to investigate. Are you sure you're okay? I was speechless. The operator seemed to know more than I did. How could she have known that? I'm the only one here, I stammered. You should leave. Now. Before I could respond, the call ended. My blood ran cold. I bolted for the exit, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I reached the front door, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The door was locked from the outside. There was no way I was getting out. I turned around and looked back into the factory. The shadow was there again, standing motionless in the doorway. This time I didn't wait. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I went, just needing to escape. I made it to the parking lot and looked back one last time. The factory stood silent, its windows staring blankly back at me. I never returned. The police found nothing when they investigated the next day. No signs of a break-in, no footprints, no fingerprints. Just an empty, decaying factory. But every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow standing still, waiting. And I hear that whisper again, "You shouldn't be here." Alright, that's all the stories for today. I'm so glad you stayed with me until the end. It really means a lot. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.